Almost 3,000 years ago, you find yourself standing before the immense mud brick walls of an Assyrian city, their surface still cool from the long night. The present day feels impossibly distant, as though it belongs to someone else entirely. Here the air carries a faint scent of dust and ash mixed with something sharper, perhaps the lingering smoke of last night's cooking fires. The sky is only just beginning to lighten, a pale wash of color stretching over the horizon, and already the city is waking. You hear it first, a low murmur behind the gates, sandals scuffing against packed earth, a cartwheel creaking somewhere inside, turning slowly as if reluctant to begin another day. For a moment, it feels as though you are hovering outside of time, listening to a world that has not yet noticed you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing, tell me where you are in the world and what time it is for you right now. There is something oddly comforting about knowing how many different nights and mornings we share together. Now dim the lights. The gates ahead of you are tall, reinforced with wood and bands of metal. Records confirm that Assyrian cities were often heavily fortified, their walls not just for defense, but as a statement. Strength was not hidden here. It was displayed, announced, and quietly enforced. Even at this early hour, a pair of guards stands watch. Their posture is rigid, their expressions unreadable. They are not chatting, not laughing, just watching. You approach, and though no one speaks to you, the atmosphere shifts. There is a sense that every movement is being measured, weighed. A curious footnote in Assyrian records mentions that guards were expected to remain alert at all times, with punishments for negligence that were, let us say, not gentle. You do not need details to understand the pressure that must sit behind those steady eyes. The gates open with a deep groaning sound, and you step inside. Immediately, the world changes. The city is alive in a quiet, controlled way. People move with purpose, not the chaotic rush of a modern street, but something more deliberate. A woman passes you carrying a clay jar, her steps careful, her gaze fixed ahead. A boy follows behind her, dragging what looks like a bundle of reeds. Somewhere to your left, a donkey snorts softly, its breath visible in the cool morning air. Your mind drifts across the narrow street. The ground beneath your feet is uneven, packed earth worn smooth in places by countless footsteps. The buildings rise close on either side, their walls plain, almost severe. There is no wasted decoration here. Everything feels practical, functional, as though beauty itself must justify its existence. Oddly enough, archaeologists have found that many Assyrian homes looked quite modest from the outside, even when the families inside were relatively well off. Privacy mattered. Appearances, at least on the street, were not the priority. You might expect a great empire to show off at every corner, but here the display of power is more selective, more controlled. In your ears, the echo changes as you walk deeper into the city. The narrow streets amplify every sound. A cough, a whispered exchange, the distant clink of metal. Somewhere far off, a hammer strikes against something hard, steady, and rhythmic, like a heartbeat you cannot quite see. You begin to notice something else: order. People keep to certain paths, certain spaces. There is a pattern to their movement, subtle but undeniable. A council decree proves that Assyrian cities were carefully organized with designated areas for markets, residences, and administrative buildings. Even if you cannot see the full plan from where you stand, you can feel it. This is not a place that has grown randomly. It has been shaped. And shaping here often comes with a firm hand. Scholars bicker over just how tightly controlled daily life was for ordinary Assyrians. Some argue that the state's presence was constant pressing into every corner of existence. Others suggest that beyond the main roads and official spaces, people found small pockets of freedom, quiet routines that belonged only to them. As you watch a man pause to adjust the strap of his sandals, glancing briefly at the sky, as if measuring the day ahead, you wonder which version feels closer to the truth. Perhaps it is both. A faint breeze moves through the street, carrying with it the smell of baking bread. It is warm, comforting, almost familiar. For a moment, the distance of centuries fades, replaced by something simple and human. Hunger, routine, the small rituals that begin a day, no matter the empire. You follow the scent, turning a corner. Here the street widens slightly. A few people have gathered around a low oven built into the side of a building. The fire inside glows softly, its heat brushing against your skin as you step closer. A woman reaches in with practiced ease, pulling out a flat round of bread and setting it aside to cool. Her movements are efficient, almost automatic, shaped by repetition. Records confirm that bread was a staple of the Assyrian diet, made from barley or wheat and baked daily. It is not luxurious. It does not need to be. It sustains. One scandalous, aside from ancient texts, hints that disputes over food could become surprisingly intense, especially in crowded urban areas where supply and demand did not always align. It is strange to imagine arguments breaking out over something as basic as bread, but then again, some things never really change. You linger for a moment, watching the quiet exchange of goods. A nod, a small gesture, no loud bargaining, at least not yet. The day is still young. As you step away, your hand brushes against the wall beside you. The surface is rough, the texture of dried mud and straw pressing faintly into your skin. It is cool now, but you can already imagine how it will feel under the midday sun radiating heat back into the narrow streets. For a moment, it feels as though the city itself is breathing, slow, steady, controlled. Above you, the sky has brightened further, shifting from pale gray to soft gold. The shadows are retreating, and with them the last traces of night. More people are emerging now, more movement. The murmur grows louder, though it never quite becomes a roar. There is always a sense of restraint. You pause, taking it all in. The walls, the people, the quiet rhythm of a place that exists under watchful eyes, even when those eyes are not immediately visible. Somewhere beyond these streets, you know, stand the palaces and temples, the centers of power that shape everything you see. You cannot see them yet, but their presence is felt in every careful step, every measured glance. No agreement has been reached on whether ordinary citizens lived in constant fear of authority or simply accepted it as part of life, as natural as the rising sun. Standing here, you sense something in between. Not panic, not ease, but awareness. A kind of quiet vigilance. The city continues to wake around you, and you realize that you are no longer just observing. You are part of the flow now, another figure moving through the narrow streets, breathing the same air, following the same slow rhythm of morning. And as the light grows stronger, you begin to understand that this is only the beginning. For a moment, it feels as though the city itself tightens around you as the morning deepens. The soft quiet of dawn begins to give way to something firmer, more structured. Not louder exactly, but more intentional. In your ears, the rhythm of footsteps becomes steadier, more synchronized, as if guided by an invisible hand. You follow the main street as it gently widens, and the change is immediate. The buildings here are taller, their walls straighter, their surfaces more carefully finished. A faint scent of oil and polished wood drifts through the air, replacing the earlier smell of baking bread. It suggests preparation maintenance, something official. Records confirm that Assyrian cities were not just places to live, but instruments of empire, carefully designed to reflect power and maintain control. You can feel that now in the spacing of the structures, in the way the street seems to guide you forward without asking permission. A group of men passes you, each carrying a spear. Their pace is even their eyes forward, not hurried, not relaxed, simply precise. The iron tips of their weapons catch the morning light flashing briefly as they move. You notice how others on the street subtly adjust their paths, giving them space without needing to be told. Oddly enough, Assyria was among the first empires to make widespread use of iron weapons, which gave its armies a significant advantage over many rivals still relying on bronze. It is a quiet detail, almost easy to miss. But here, in the glint of a spearhead, you see its impact. Your mind drifts to the idea of an empire built not just on conquest, but on consistency. Discipline repeated day after day until it becomes second nature. A council decree proves that military service was deeply embedded in Assyrian society. Men were expected to serve when called, and the system was organized enough to draw on vast numbers of soldiers from across the empire. It is not simply a profession here. It is an expectation, a thread woven into daily life. You pause near the edge of the street as the soldiers pass, noticing the details you might otherwise overlook. The way their sandals are secured tightly, the slight wear on their tunics, suggesting long use rather than display. One man adjusts the strap across his chest without breaking stride, a small motion practiced countless times. One scandalous aside from ancient accounts suggests that some soldiers, despite the strict discipline, found ways to bend the rules when far from watchful eyes, trading goods, or taking small liberties during campaigns. The empire demands order, but human nature has its own quiet persistence. As the group disappears around a corner, the space they leave behind feels briefly larger, as though their presence had been holding the street in place. You continue walking, drawn toward a structure that rises ahead, more imposing than the others. Its entrance is framed by carved stone, the surface etched with figures that seem to move as you approach. Warriors, animals, scenes of conquest. The carvings are detailed almost unnervingly, so each line deliberate. For a moment, it feels as though the figures are watching you. Scholars bicker over how these reliefs were meant to be perceived by ordinary people. Some argue they were straightforward propaganda, designed to impress and intimidate. Others suggest they carried deeper symbolic meanings, stories layered within stories. Standing here, you suspect they do both at once. The stone beneath your fingertips is cool and smooth, where it has been worn by countless hands. You trace the outline of a carved figure, feeling the shallow grooves left by a craftsman who lived and worked nearly 3,000 years ago. There is something strangely intimate about it, this quiet connection across time. Inside, the air shifts again. It is cooler, dimmer. The sounds of the street soften, replaced by a muted echo that seems to linger just a moment longer than expected. You hear footsteps somewhere deeper within, measured and calm. This space does not feel like a home or a market. It feels official, controlled. Records confirm that Assyrian administrative buildings were centers of coordination where orders were issued, records kept, and the machinery of empire quietly turned. You can almost imagine the flow of information here, messages arriving from distant provinces, reports being recorded, decisions made that will ripple outward across vast distances. Your hand brushes against a wooden doorframe, the grain worn smooth in places. The wood feels solid, dependable, as though it has been reinforced not just physically, but symbolically. Nothing here is left to chance. A curious footnote in historical texts mentions that the Assyrians developed an efficient system of provincial governance, dividing their empire into regions overseen by officials loyal to the king. It is an early form of something that feels surprisingly modern. Layers of authority, each reinforcing the other. You step back outside, blinking slightly as the sunlight greets you again. The street is busier now. Merchants are setting up their goods, arranging items with careful attention. A man unrolls a length of fabric, smoothing it out with both hands. Another adjusts a stack of clay jars, testing their balance before stepping away. Yet even here, in what might seem like ordinary daily activity, there is a sense of oversight. You notice a figure standing slightly apart, watching, not interfering, not speaking, just observing. No agreement has been reached on how visible state control was in everyday interactions like these. Some argue that officials were ever present, ensuring compliance. Others believe their influence was more subtle, felt rather than seen. As you watch the silent observer, you realize it might not matter which is true. The effect is the same. A faint metallic scent lingers in the air, perhaps from nearby workshops. It mixes with the smell of dust and fabric, creating something oddly grounding. You reach out, brushing your fingers across a piece of cloth. It is rough, woven, tightly practical rather than decorative. Your mind drifts again, this time to the idea of identity. In a place like this, who are you really? A farmer when the fields call, a soldier when the king demands, a subject always. The roles seem to overlap, shifting as needed, guided by forces larger than any one person. Records confirm that the Assyrian Empire relied heavily on this flexibility, drawing labor and service from its population in ways that kept the system functioning smoothly. It is efficient, effective, and perhaps at times exhausting. One scandalous aside suggests that not everyone accepted these demands quietly. There are hints of resistance, small acts of defiance that rarely make it into official records. A missed duty, a delayed delivery, tiny fractures in the surface of order. You glance around, wondering how many such moments are unfolding even now, hidden within the flow of the city. The sun has risen higher, casting sharper shadows along the street. The light catches on metal, on polished surfaces, on the edges of carved stone. Everything seems more defined, more exposed, and yet beneath it all, the same steady rhythm continues. For a moment, it feels as though you are standing inside a living machine, not cold, not lifeless, but precise, every part moving in relation to the others, guided by rules that are rarely spoken aloud, but always understood. As you take another step forward, the distant sound of a horn drifts through the air. Low, resonant, impossible to ignore. You pause, listening. Whatever comes next, you sense, will not be random. The low call of the horn lingers in the air, vibrating softly against the walls and into your chest. For a moment, it feels as though the entire city pauses, not stopping completely, but adjusting like a breath drawn in unison. Your attention shifts upward, without quite knowing why, as if something larger than the streets themselves has just made itself known. You continue forward, following the direction from which the sound seemed to come. The streets begin to slope gently, the ground beneath your feet becoming firmer, more carefully maintained. There is less debris here, fewer scattered reeds or loose stones. Even the air feels slightly different, touched with a faint scent of resin and polished surfaces. In your ears, the city's murmur fades just enough for another layer of sound to emerge. Voices quieter but more deliberate, the rustle of fine fabric, the subtle clink of metal ornaments rather than tools. For a moment, it feels as though you have crossed an invisible boundary. Records confirm that the Assyrian king was not simply a ruler, but the central force of the empire's identity, believed to act with divine support and authority. You may not see him, not yet, but his presence presses gently into everything around you, shaping the space without needing to appear. You notice how people move here. They are more careful, more measured. A man carrying a small bundle pauses to let another pass, lowering his gaze slightly in a gesture that feels practiced. A woman adjusts her shawl, pulling it closer as she steps aside. No one rushes. No one lingers too long. Your mind drifts to the idea of distance, not just physical distance, but social. The king exists somewhere beyond these streets within walls that few will ever cross, and yet his influence reaches all the way out here into the smallest gestures of ordinary life. Oddly enough, inscriptions from the period often describe the king as chosen by the gods, especially the god Asher, whose name the empire itself bears. It is not just political authority. It is something deeper, something that blends belief with power so completely that separating them becomes almost impossible. You turn a corner and the space opens before you. The building ahead is unmistakable. Larger than anything you have seen so far, its entrance guarded not just by soldiers, but by towering figures carved from stone. Winged creatures with human faces, their bodies strong and still, their gaze fixed outward, as if watching both the present and something beyond it. For a moment, it feels as though they are alive. Scholars bicker over the exact purpose of these figures, often called lamassu. Some argue they were protective spirits meant to guard the palace from harm. Others suggest they were symbols of power, designed to impress and intimidate anyone who approached. Standing here, you suspect they do both, and perhaps more. You step closer, drawn by their scale. The stone beneath your hand is cool, almost cold, despite the growing warmth of the morning. You trace the edge of a carved wing, feeling the precise lines, the careful work of someone who understood both art and authority. A curious footnote in Assyrian records mentions that these statues were often placed at key entrances, not just for decoration, but as part of a broader statement. Nothing about this place is accidental. Every detail speaks. The guards at the entrance stand straighter as you approach. Their presence is heavier here, more formal. The spears they hold are polished, their armor better maintained. You notice the way their eyes move, not just watching the crowd, but scanning, assessing. A council decree proves that access to the king was tightly controlled, with layers of officials and guards, ensuring that only certain individuals could approach. Even without seeing the inner halls, you can feel those layers now like invisible walls, stacked one behind the other. You do not attempt to enter. It is not a place for wandering curiosity. Instead, you remain just outside observing. People come and go, but not in large numbers. A pair of officials walks past their robes, finer than most. You have seen their conversation low and focused. A servant follows behind them, carrying something wrapped carefully in cloth. The exchange at the entrance is brief, efficient, almost silent. One scandalous, aside from ancient texts, hints that court life, despite its rigid structure, was not without intrigue. Whispers of rivalries, hidden alliances, and quiet power struggles appear in fragments, suggesting that even in the most controlled environment, human ambition finds a way. You watch as the officials disappear inside the heavy doors, closing behind them with a muted thud. For a moment, the space feels even more distant. Your mind drifts again, this time, to the idea of visibility. The king is everywhere, in symbol, in decree, and expectation, and yet he is almost never seen. His absence becomes a kind of presence, a constant reminder of power that does not need to show itself to be felt. No agreement has been reached on how often ordinary citizens actually saw their king. Some scholars believe appearances were rare, carefully staged events meant to reinforce authority. Others suggest there may have been more frequent interactions, though still limited. As you stand here, the uncertainty feels fitting. Power, after all, often works best when it remains just out of reach. A faint breeze moves through the open space, carrying with it the scent of incense from somewhere within the palace complex. It is subtle, almost hidden beneath the sharper smells of the city, but it lingers, marking this place as different. You step back slowly, giving the entrance a final glance. The Lamassu stand unchanged, their silent watch continuing. The guards remain still, their attention unwavering. The doors do not open again, at least not while you watch. As you turn away, the sounds of the city begin to return, gradually filling the space that had been held by the palace's quiet gravity. The murmur of voices, the movement of carts, the distant rhythm of work, resuming its steady pace. Yet something has shifted. You carry with you the sense of a center, a point around which everything else revolves. Even as you move back into the narrower streets, that awareness does not fade. It settles quietly into your understanding of this place. The empire is not just built on walls and soldiers. It is built on presence, seen and unseen, spoken and unspoken. And as you walk, the city seems to adjust around you once more, its rhythm continuing its structure, holding firm, its watchful gaze never quite lifting. As you move away from the palace gates, the impression lingers like the faint scent of incense still caught in your breath. The streets begin to narrow again, but something about them feels different now. You are no longer simply wandering. You are aware of what stands at the center, and it subtly changes how everything else appears. For a moment, it feels as though the city itself is telling a story not through words, but through stone. Your steps carry you along a wall that rises higher than the others, its surface smoother, more deliberate. Then gradually shapes begin to emerge, lines, figures, scenes unfolding across the stone as if time has been carved into it. You slow without thinking. The carvings stretch along the wall in long panels, each one filled with movement. Warriors marching in careful lines, archers drawing their bows, horses mid-stride, muscles tense beneath their carved skin. There is no chaos here, no confusion. Every figure has its place, its role. Records confirm that Assyrian palaces were decorated with extensive reliefs depicting military victories, royal hunts, and scenes of power. They were not hidden away. They were meant to be seen, to be understood even by those who could not read. You step closer, your fingers brushing the stone. The surface is cool, though the rising sun has begun to warm the edges. You trace the outline of a chariot wheel, noticing the precision of each spoke. The craftsmanship is astonishing, but it is the intention behind it that holds your attention. This is not decoration for its own sake. This is narrative. A curious footnote suggests that many of these reliefs were originally painted in bright colors, reds, blues, and golds that have long since faded. It is strange to imagine these scenes not in muted stone, but vivid and alive, almost overwhelming in their intensity. Your mind drifts as you picture it, the walls glowing with color, the figures seeming to move, the victories not just remembered, but constantly relived. In your ears, the faint scrape of sandals returns, grounding you again in the present moment. A man pauses near the wall, glancing at the carvings, before continuing on his way. His expression does not change, but the glance itself feels significant. Scholars bicker over how ordinary people interpreted these images. Some argue they served as clear reminders of the king's power, reinforcing loyalty through repetition. Others believe viewers may have brought their own meanings, seeing not just triumph, but warning, not just glory, but consequence. You move along the wall, the scene shifting as you go. Here a procession of captives, their heads bowed, their hands bound. The detail is quieter, less triumphant, but no less deliberate. Their expressions are carved with care, not exaggerated, not softened. One scandalous aside in ancient writings hints that such depictions were meant to send a message as much as celebrate a victory. Not just look what we have done, but look what could happen. You pause, the weight of that thought settling gently. The empire does not only show strength, it shows outcome. A breeze moves past you, carrying the dry scent of dust mixed with something sharper, perhaps from a nearby workshop. You notice how the light plays across the carvings, now casting small shadows into the grooves, giving depth to every figure. For a moment, it feels as though the wall itself is alive, shifting with the angle of the sun. You reach out again this time, tracing a line of cuneiform script running along the edge of a panel. The marks are small, precise, arranged in careful rows. You cannot read them, but their presence adds another layer to the story. A council decree proves that these inscriptions often recorded the achievements of the king, detailing campaigns, victories, and offerings to the gods. They are not just images, they are records, statements meant to endure. Your mind lingers on that word, endure. Oddly enough, many of these reliefs have survived thousands of years, outlasting the empire that created them. The people who carved them are long gone. The king they praised is no longer here, and yet the story remains pressed into stone. You continue walking, the scenes shifting from battle to something quieter. A hunt. The king stands in a chariot, drawing his bow as a lion lunges toward him. The tension in the scene is unmistakable, the moment captured just before release. The lion's body is twisted, its muscles carved with careful attention, its expression fierce and alive. You feel a slight tightening in your chest, an instinctive response to the movement frozen in the stone. Records confirm that royal lion hunts were a significant part of Assyrian culture, symbolizing the king's power over both nature and chaos. They were not simply sport. they were performance ritual proof. A curious footnote suggests that some of these hunts may have been staged within controlled environments, ensuring the king's safety while still presenting the image of danger. It is an oddly practical detail tucked quietly beneath the grandeur. You study the scene wondering where the line between reality and representation truly lies. No agreement has been reached on how literal these depictions are. Some scholars argue they reflect actual events with surprising accuracy. Others suggest they are carefully crafted narratives, emphasizing certain elements while omitting others. As you move on, the wall begins to give way to an open courtyard. The shift is immediate. The enclosed story-filled space opens into something broader, quieter. The ground is smoother here, the air moving more freely. A few figures cross the space, their footsteps soft against the packed earth. You pause at the edge, glancing back at the wall. It stands unchanged, its stories continuing, whether you look at them or not. For a moment, it feels as though you have stepped out of a memory and back into the present. But the images remain with you. The marching soldiers, the captured enemies, the king facing the lion. They settle into your thoughts, not loudly, not insistently, but steadily. And as you turn to continue through the courtyard, you begin to understand that in this city, history is not something distant. It is something you walk alongside, something you touch, something that quietly reminds you with every carved line and careful detail exactly who holds power here. The open courtyard feels almost calm after the weight of carved stone and silent stories. The air moves more freely here, brushing gently against your skin, carrying with it the faint scent of leather dust and something sharper beneath it. Not unpleasant, just purposeful. For a moment, it feels as though the city has shifted its focus again. You notice them before you fully understand what you are seeing. Men gathered in small groups along the edges of the courtyard, some standing, some seated on low benches or directly on the ground. Their posture is different from the merchants and laborers you passed earlier, straighter, more contained. Even at rest, there is a readiness in the way they hold themselves. Soldiers. You step closer, drawn not by noise, but by the quiet intensity of their presence. There is no loud conversation, no easy laughter. Instead, you hear low voices, short exchanges, the occasional clink of metal meeting metal as equipment is adjusted or checked. Records confirm that the Assyrian army was one of the most organized and effective military forces of its time, built on disciplined training and a clear chain of command. Standing here, you can feel that structure even in moments that appear relaxed. A man sits nearby, carefully sharpening the edge of a blade. The motion is steady, practiced, the stone sliding along the metal with a soft, rhythmic sound. You find yourself focusing on that sound, the repetition almost soothing in its consistency. Your mind drifts to the idea of preparation. Not dramatic, not rushed, just constant. Another soldier adjusts the straps of his armor, pulling them tighter, then loosening slightly, testing the fit. His expression does not change, but there is a quiet concentration in his movements. He is not simply wearing the armor. He is becoming accustomed to it, ensuring it will not fail him later. Oddly enough, Assyrian soldiers were equipped with a range of weapons, including spears, bows, swords, and shields, many of which were standardized to ensure efficiency in battle. It is an early glimpse of something that feels very familiar. Uniformity, not for appearance, but for function. You shift your weight, noticing the texture of the ground beneath your sandals. The packed earth here is firmer, worn smooth by repeated use. It carries a faint warmth now as the sun continues to rise. A council decree proves that military service was not limited to a single class. Farmers, craftsmen, and laborers could all be called upon, forming a force that drew from across society. The army is not separate from the people. It is the people. You glance around, again studying the faces more carefully. Some are older. Their features line their movements, efficient with experience. Others are younger, their expressions still settling into the discipline expected of them. One man shifts slightly, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon in a way that feels almost unconscious, as though the motion has become part of him. A curious footnote in ancient texts suggests that some soldiers took pride in personalizing small elements of their gear, subtle markings or adjustments that set them apart while still maintaining overall uniformity. It is a quiet balance between individuality and order. You hear a voice rise slightly, not loud but firm. An older soldier speaks to a smaller group, his tone measured. You cannot make out the words, but the rhythm suggests instruction rather than conversation. The others listen closely, their attention fixed. For a moment, it feels as though you are watching knowledge being passed not through formal ceremony, but through repetition and presence. Scholars bicker over how much of Assyrian military success came from strict discipline versus adaptability in the field. Some argue that their rigid structure ensured reliability. Others believe their willingness to adjust tactics gave them an edge. As you watch the subtle exchange between the older soldier and the younger men, you sense that both may be true. Structure provides the frame. Experience fills it in. A faint metallic scent lingers in the air, mixing with the dryness of dust and the faint tang of sweat. It is not overwhelming, just enough to remind you of the physical reality behind the discipline. You step a little further into the courtyard, careful not to interrupt the flow of movement. A pair of soldiers rises and begins to walk toward the far side, their pace, even their steps, aligned without conscious effort. In your ears, the rhythm returns again. Footsteps steady and controlled. One scandalous aside from historical accounts hints that despite the strict expectations, not all soldiers were unwavering in their loyalty, especially those drawn from distant regions of the empire. There are mentions of hesitation, even quiet resistance, though rarely in ways that openly challenged authority. You consider that for a moment. An empire this large cannot rely solely on obedience. It must also manage doubt. The sun climbs higher and the light sharpens, casting clearer lines across the courtyard. The edges of armor catch the brightness, small flashes of reflection that move as the men shift and adjust. You notice how little is wasted here. Movements are efficient, conversations are brief, even rest seems purposeful, as though it is simply another form of preparation. No agreement has been reached on how soldiers themselves felt about their role. Some scholars suggest a strong sense of pride and identity tied to the empire's success. Others believe many served out of obligation, their loyalty shaped more by necessity than belief. As you watch a young soldier glance briefly at his hands before tightening his grip on a strap, you wonder what passes through his mind in that moment. Is it anticipation, routine, something quieter, harder to name? A breeze moves through the courtyard, lifting a small swirl of dust before settling again. The movement is brief, almost unnoticed, but it draws your attention upward for a moment. The sky is now fully bright, the soft colors of dawn, replaced by a clearer, sharper blue. The day has begun in earnest, and here at the heart of this gathering, you begin to understand something more clearly. The empire does not only rely on its king or its walls or its carved stories. It relies on these men, their discipline, their readiness, their quiet, constant preparation. As you step back toward the edge of the courtyard, the rhythm of sharpening blades and measured voices continues behind you, steady and unbroken. It does not demand your attention. It simply exists, and that somehow makes it all the more powerful. The steady rhythm of the courtyard fades behind you, though it does not disappear entirely. It lingers like a distant echo of metal against stone, following you as you turn into a narrower passage. The air shifts again, warmer now, carrying a mix of dust and something sharper, perhaps oiled wood or leather left in the sun. For a moment, it feels as though you have stepped into a quieter layer of the city. You hear voices ahead, higher in pitch, less restrained, not chaotic, but not yet shaped into the measured tone of the soldiers you just left behind. There is a lightness to the sound, an energy that has not fully settled. You follow it. The passage opens into a smaller training ground enclosed by low walls. The ground here is uneven, marked with footprints and shallow grooves, evidence of repeated movement. A group of boys stands in a loose formation, each holding a wooden staff. They are not perfectly still. One shifts his weight. Another glances briefly to the side before correcting himself. A third tightens his grip, knuckles whitening for a moment before relaxing again. There is effort here, but also uncertainty. Records confirm that Assyrian boys, particularly those from certain families, began training for military service at a young age, learning discipline, physical skills, and loyalty long before they were expected to fight. Watching them now, you can see the beginning of that process. A man stands before them, his posture straight, his presence unmistakable. He does not shout. He does not need to. When he raises his hand slightly, the boys adjust almost instantly, their attention snapping back into place. Your mind drifts to the idea of repetition, instruction given not once but again and again until it settles into the body itself. The instructor steps forward, demonstrating a movement. He lifts his staff, angles it, then brings it down in a controlled motion. The action is smooth, precise, without excess. The boys watch closely, their eyes following every detail. They mimic him, not perfectly, not yet. One boy's movement is too quick, his balance shifting awkwardly. Another hesitates his strike, lacking force. The instructor moves among them, making small adjustments. A shift of the hand, a correction of stance. Each change is subtle but deliberate. Oddly enough, some ancient sources suggest that training emphasized coordination and endurance as much as strength, ensuring that soldiers could maintain formation and rhythm over long periods. It is not about individual flair. It is about consistency. You step closer, careful not to draw attention. The ground beneath your feet feels rougher here, scattered with small stones that press lightly through your sandals. The sun has begun to warm the surface, creating a faint contrast between the cooler shaded areas and the brighter open space. A council decree proves that loyalty to the king was instilled early, not just through training, but through constant reinforcement of hierarchy and duty. It is not simply about learning to fight, it is about understanding where you stand. One boy glances up briefly, his eyes meeting yours for just a moment before dropping again. There is curiosity there, quickly hidden beneath concentration. He adjusts his grip on the staff, correcting himself before the instructor can step in. A curious footnote in historical records mentions that some boys trained together for years, forming bonds that would carry into their adult service. Friendships shaped in discipline, tested in shared effort. It is a quieter aspect of this world, easily overlooked. The instructor calls out a short command. This time the boys move together. Not perfectly synchronized, but closer than before. The staffs rise and fall in near unison, the sound of wood cutting through air, creating a soft collective rhythm. For a moment, it feels almost like a rehearsal, a preparation for something larger. Scholars bicker over how formalized this early training truly was. Some argue it followed strict organized systems. Others believe it varied widely depending on region and family status. As you watch the careful guidance of the instructor, you suspect structure plays a significant role, even if it is not identical everywhere. The boys pause, breathing slightly heavier now. You notice the small details, a bead of sweat forming at a temple, the way one shifts his stance to relieve pressure on his foot, the quick glance exchanged between two of them, a flicker of shared effort before their focus returns. One scandalous, aside from ancient accounts, suggests that not all boys embraced this training willingly. There are hints of resistance, small acts of reluctance that rarely surface in official records. A missed practice, a half-hearted effort. You look at their faces again, wondering which of them might feel that quiet resistance hidden beneath the surface of obedience. The instructor steps back, observing. For a moment, he says nothing. The silence stretches, not uncomfortable, but expectant. Then, with a slight nod, he signals them to begin again. And they do. This time the movements are steadier, more aligned. The rhythm settles into something closer to what you saw in the courtyard beyond. Not yet the same, but moving toward it. In your ears, the soft thud of staffs meeting the ground blends with the distant sounds of the city. A cart rolling somewhere beyond the walls, a voice calling out in the distance. The world continues, even as this small space focuses on shaping what will come. No agreement has been reached on how much choice these boys truly had in their future roles. Some scholars suggest that expectation and tradition guided them almost inevitably toward service. Others believe there may have been paths that allowed for different lives, though perhaps not easily. As one boy adjusts his stance once more, determination settling into his posture, you sense the weight of that uncertainty. The sun climbs higher and the light sharpens across the training ground. Shadows shorten movements, become clearer, more defined. The boys continue their efforts, building slowly, repetition, layering upon repetition, and as you watch, you begin to understand how the soldiers you saw earlier came to move with such precision. It did not begin in the battlefield. It began here, in small corrections, in quiet persistence, in the steady shaping of movement and mind. You step back toward the edge of the training ground, the rhythm of their practice continuing behind you, soft but unbroken. It will go on for some time, long enough to settle, long enough to become something that no longer needs to be thought about, only done. The steady thud of wooden staffs fades behind you, replaced once again by the layered sounds of the city. This time, though, the rhythm feels fuller. The day has properly begun, and with it comes a different kind of energy. Not the quiet discipline of training, but something more fluid, more alive. For a moment, it feels as though the city exhales. You follow the widening path until it opens into a broad space where voices rise and overlap, forming a low, constant hum. The scent reaches you first, spices sharp and earthy, fresh bread still warm, a faint sweetness you cannot quite place, drifting lightly through the air. The market. It spreads out before you in careful order, though at first glance it might seem like chaos. Stalls line the edges, arranged in rows that guide the flow of people through narrow passages. Goods are laid out with intention, each space clearly defined. Records confirm that Assyrian markets were regulated environments, often overseen by officials who ensured fair trade, standardized measures, and the collection of taxes. Even here, in a place that feels lively and free structure remains. You step into the flow. A man passes you carrying a basket of dates, their deep color catching the sunlight. He moves with practiced ease, weaving through the crowd without hesitation. Nearby, a woman arranges small clay jars, adjusting their position until they sit just right. Your mind drifts to the idea of routine again, but here it takes on a different tone, less rigid, more adaptable. A council decree proves that trade was vital to the Assyrian economy, bringing goods not only from nearby farms, but from distant regions across the empire and beyond. As you glance around, you begin to notice the variety. Fabrics in muted reds and browns woven tightly and stacked neatly. Metal tools, their edges catching the light. Bundles of herbs tied together, their scent strong and unmistakable. There is a quiet abundance here, not extravagant, but steady. Oddly enough, some ancient records mention strict penalties for merchants who used false weights or measures, suggesting that fairness in trade was taken seriously, at least in principle. It is a reminder that even small transactions carried weight. You pause at a stall where a man carefully measures grain into a container. His movements are precise, his eyes focused on the task. A customer watches closely, her gaze fixed on the measure as it fills. There is no raised voice, no argument, just attention. A curious footnote suggests that disputes in markets were often resolved quickly, sometimes on the spot to prevent disruption. Efficiency over drama. You move on, letting the flow carry you further. The ground beneath your feet is packed and slightly uneven, worn by countless steps. It feels warmer now, the sun pressing down more firmly as the morning advances. You adjust your pace, matching the rhythm around you. In your ears, the sounds layer together, the murmur of conversation, the soft clink of pottery, the rustle of fabric being unfolded and refolded. It is not loud, but it is constant, like a steady current. Scholars bicker over how much freedom merchants truly had within these regulated markets. Some argue that strict oversight limited innovation and personal gain. Others believe that within the structure, there was room for negotiation and subtle strategy. As you watch a brief exchange of goods accompanied by a slight nod and a barely visible shift of hands, you suspect there is more happening beneath the surface than is immediately apparent. A young boy moves quickly past you carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. His steps are light, his expression focused. He disappears into the crowd, weaving between figures with surprising ease. One scandalous, aside from historical accounts, hints that markets could also be places of quiet gossip and information exchange, where news traveled just as quickly as goods. You glance around, wondering how many conversations hold more than simple trade. You stop near a stall displaying small metal objects. The items are arranged carefully, their surfaces polished. You reach out, lifting one gently. It is heavier than it looks, cool against your skin. The merchant watches you, his expression neutral but attentive. He says nothing, waiting. You set the object back down, and he nods slightly, the exchange complete without words. Your mind drifts again this time to the balance between control and movement. The market feels alive, yet it does not spill over into disorder. There are boundaries here, invisible but understood. No agreement has been reached on how strictly these boundaries were enforced at all times. Some scholars suggest that officials maintained a constant presence. Others believe their influence was more intermittent, stepping in only when necessary. As you notice a figure standing at the edge of the market, observing quietly, you sense that oversight may not always need to be obvious. The scent of spices grows stronger as you pass another stall, a mix of cumin, coriander, perhaps something sweeter. It fills the air, lingering as you move on. For a moment, it feels as though the city reveals a softer side. Not the discipline of soldiers, not the authority of the palace, but the everyday exchanges that keep life moving. You watch as two people complete a trade, their hands meeting briefly as goods are passed from one to the other. There is a small pause, a moment of acknowledgement, before they separate and continue on their way. It is simple, and yet it is everything. Records confirm that despite the empire's focus on conquest and control, daily life, for many people, centered on these kinds of interactions. Buying, selling, providing, sustaining. You take a slow breath, the mix of scents and sounds settling around you. The market continues its rhythm steady, its order intact. And as you move through it, you begin to understand that even in a warrior empire, not every moment is defined by conflict. Some are defined by grain measured carefully, by fabric smoothed into place, by quiet exchanges that pass almost unnoticed yet hold the weight of a day's survival. You step toward the far side of the market, the hum of activity following you like a soft echo. It does not fade. It simply becomes part of the background, another layer in the complex rhythm of the city. The hum of the market softens behind you, though it never fully disappears. It lingers as a distant thread woven into the larger fabric of the city's sound. As you move farther out, the streets begin to stretch wider, the buildings spacing themselves apart, as though making room for something less contained. The air shifts again. There is more dust here, carried in gentle swirls by a warmer breeze. Beneath it, a new scent rises, dry earth, cut reeds, a faint hint of water, distant but present. It draws you forward without explanation. For a moment, it feels as though the city is loosening its grip. You follow the path as it slopes gently downward, leading you toward the outer edges, where the walls no longer press so closely. The sounds change too. Fewer voices, more open space, the occasional call of an animal carried clearly through the air. Then gradually, the land opens. Fields stretch out before you, their lines uneven but purposeful, marked by low ridges and narrow channels that guide water across the soil. The green is not lush in the way you might imagine, but steady, persistent, shaped by careful effort rather than abundance. Records confirm that agriculture formed the backbone of the Assyrian economy, with crops like barley, wheat, and lentils sustaining both the population and the army. Standing here, you can see how essential this space is, even if it lacks the immediate presence of the city's walls or markets. You step onto the edge of a field, the ground beneath your feet, softer now, giving slightly with each step. It feels cooler here, touched by the faint moisture carried through the irrigation channels. A man works nearby, bending low as he moves along a row of crops. His movements are slow but steady, shaped by repetition rather than urgency. He pauses briefly, straightening his back, then continues without hesitation. Your mind drifts to the idea of endurance, not the sharp intensity of battle or the strict rhythm of training, but something quieter, sustained effort over time measured not in moments, but in seasons. A council decree proves that the Assyrian state closely monitored agricultural production, collecting taxes in the form of grain and other goods to support its vast infrastructure. Even here in this open space, the reach of authority remains. You notice the irrigation channels more clearly now. Narrow, carefully dug guiding water from a larger source beyond your sight. The flow is gentle, controlled, ensuring that each section of the field receives what it needs. Oddly enough, Assyrian engineers developed advanced irrigation systems, building canals that extended over long distances to support farming in otherwise difficult terrain. It is a quiet kind of ingenuity, less visible than armies or palaces, but no less important. You kneel briefly, letting your fingers brush the surface of the soil. It is coarse, slightly damp beneath the top layer, holding just enough moisture to sustain growth. The texture clings lightly to your skin before falling away. A curious footnote in ancient records mentions that farmers were often required to maintain these irrigation systems themselves, ensuring that water continued to flow properly. It is not just about planting and harvesting, it is about constant care. You rise again, watching as another figure moves along a different row, adjusting something at the edge of a channel. The motion is small, precise, but it changes the direction of the water, slightly guiding it where it is needed. For a moment, it feels as though the land itself is being shaped in real time. Scholars bicker over how much autonomy farmers truly had within this system. Some argue that state control dictated nearly every aspect of production. Others suggest that local knowledge and individual decision-making still played a significant role. As you watch the subtle adjustments made by the workers here, you suspect that both forces are at play. Structure and experience working together. A faint breeze moves across the fields, carrying with it the soft rustle of crops brushing against one another. The sound is gentle, almost soothing, a contrast to the more contained noise of the city. You close your eyes for a brief moment, letting the sensation settle. When you open them again, you notice something else. A cart stands at the edge of the field, partially loaded with bundles of harvested grain. The wood creaks slightly as it shifts, responding to the weight. A pair of oxen waits nearby, their presence calm, their movements slow. One scandalous, aside from historical accounts, suggests that in times of poor harvest, tensions could rise quickly, with disputes over resources becoming more frequent. It is a reminder that even in this quiet space, the balance is delicate. You watch as the man you first noticed finishes his row and steps toward the cart. His pace remains steady, unhurried, as though he is measuring his energy carefully. No agreement has been reached on how secure agricultural life truly was in the Assyrian Empire. Some scholars point to the strength of the irrigation systems and state organization as stabilizing forces. Others highlight the vulnerability to drought, conflict, and shifting demands from the center of power. As the man lifts a bundle and places it onto the cart, you see the effort in the movement, the strain balanced by experience. This is not a temporary task. This is a way of life. The sun climbs higher, its warmth spreading across the fields. The air grows drier, the scents sharper. You feel the shift on your skin, the transition from the cool of morning to the steady heat of day. And yet the work continues, unbroken, measured, essential. You take a step back, glancing once more at the lines of crops, the channels of water, the figures moving steadily within them. The empire may be known for its armies and its kings, but here you see what feeds it, not in grand gestures, not in carved stone, but in the quiet persistence of those who tend the land day after day, shaping survival from soil and water. As you turn to make your way back toward the city, the soft rustle of the fields follows you, fading slowly into the distance. It does not demand attention. It simply continues. The rustle of the fields fades behind you, replaced once more by the steady hum of the city. Yet something lingers, a quiet awareness of the labor that sustains everything within those walls. As you pass back through the outer streets, the air grows denser again, carrying familiar scents of dust, smoke, and human presence. For a moment, it feels as though you are slipping between layers of life, each one revealing a different rhythm. You turn into a narrower lane where the noise softens and the movement slows. The buildings here stand close together, their surfaces worn smooth in places by years of touch. A faint scent of ground herbs drifts through the air, mixed with something warmer, perhaps baked grain or heated clay. This space feels more private. You notice a doorway left partially open. Inside, shadows shift gently, and the faint sound of quiet conversation reaches your ears. It is softer than anything you have heard in the market or the training grounds, more contained. You step closer, careful, respectful of the boundary, yet drawn by curiosity. Inside, a small group of women moves through the space with practiced ease. One kneels near a low hearth, adjusting something within it, her hands steady as she tends the fire. Another sits nearby, working with fabric, her fingers guiding thread through cloth in slow, precise motions. Records confirm that women in Assyrian society were primarily responsible for managing the household, including food preparation, textile production, and the care of children. Watching them now, you can see how these tasks form the foundation of daily life. Your mind drifts to the quiet strength in repetition, not the visible discipline of soldiers, but something equally steady. The kind of work that continues regardless of what happens beyond these walls. A council decree proves that women's roles were defined within a structured legal framework, with rights and restrictions that varied depending on status and circumstance. It is not a simple picture. There is both limitation and influence woven together. One woman rises carrying a small clay bowl across the room. Her steps are careful, her movement efficient. She pauses briefly, adjusting the position of an object before continuing on. You notice how little is wasted here. Every motion serves a purpose. A curious footnote in ancient records suggests that some women, particularly those connected to wealthier households or temples, could hold significant influence behind the scenes, managing resources and directing labor. It is a quieter form of power, less visible, but no less real. You shift slightly, your hand brushing against the edge of the doorway. The wood is smooth in places, rough in others, shaped by years of use. It feels solid grounding. Inside, a younger girl watches the others closely, her eyes following each movement. She mimics a small action, adjusting a piece of cloth before glancing up for approval. A subtle nod is given and she returns to her task. For a moment, it feels as though knowledge is being passed without words. Scholars bicker over how much agency women truly had within these domestic spaces. Some argue that strict social norms limited their independence. Others suggest that within the household, women exercised a degree of control that is not always visible in official records. As you watch the quiet coordination between them, you sense that the truth may lie somewhere between. A faint scent of smoke rises as the fire is adjusted, curling gently upward, before fading into the air. It mixes with the earthy smell of clay and the softer note of fabric creating something almost comforting. You step back slightly, allowing the scene to continue, without your presence intruding further. Outside, the lane remains calm. A child passes by, carrying a small bundle, his steps quick but careful. He glances briefly toward the doorway before continuing on. One scandalous, aside from historical texts, hints at tensions that could arise within households, disputes over resources, responsibilities, or expectations. These moments rarely appear in formal accounts, but they exist just beneath the surface of daily life. You consider that as you walk on. The lane curves gently, leading you past more doorways, some open, some closed. Each one holds its own rhythm, its own quiet world. The sounds that drift out are varied. The soft murmur of voices, the faint scrape of tools, the occasional laugh quickly subdued. No agreement has been reached on how much these domestic spaces differed from one another across the empire. Some scholars suggest a shared structure shaped by cultural norms. Others believe local traditions introduced subtle variations. As you pass from one doorway to the next, you sense both familiarity and difference. A breeze moves through the lane, carrying the scent of dried herbs hanging somewhere out of sight. It brushes lightly against your skin, cool for just a moment, before the warmth returns. You pause, looking back the way you came. The city continues layered and complex. The soldiers in their courtyard, the boys in their training ground, the farmers in the fields. And here within these walls, the steady work of those who maintain the rhythm of daily life. It is quieter, less visible, but no less essential. Records confirm that without the labor performed in these spaces, the larger structures of the empire could not function. Food prepared, clothing made, children raised. You take a slow breath, letting the stillness settle. Then you turn again, stepping forward. As the lane opens slightly ahead, the sounds of the wider city beginning to return. The rhythm continues, always. The quiet lane releases you gradually back into the wider rhythm of the city. The sounds grow fuller again, not overwhelming, just layered. Footsteps, voices, the occasional creak of wood under strain. Yet beneath it all, there is a subtle shift, something heavier, less open. For a moment, it feels as though the air itself carries a different weight. You follow the curve of the street until it narrows again, but this time, the feeling is not one of privacy. It is containment. The buildings here stand closer, their walls higher, casting longer shadows that linger even as the sun climbs. A faint metallic scent touches the air, mixed with something you cannot immediately place. Not unpleasant, but sharper than before. You notice them. Figures moving quietly, their posture more restrained than those you have seen in the market or the households. Their clothing is simpler, worn in places lacking the small touches of personalization you noticed earlier among the soldiers. Their movements are efficient, but there is a difference. Less choice in the way they carry themselves. You slow your steps. Records confirm that the Assyrian Empire relied heavily on enslaved people and captives taken during military campaigns, integrating them into labor systems that supported construction, agriculture, and domestic work. Standing here, you begin to see that reality not as an abstract idea, but as a presence within the city itself. A group passes you carrying heavy loads balanced carefully between them. The wood of the poles presses against their shoulders, leaving faint marks that suggest long familiarity with the weight. Their pace is steady, but there is no pause, no moment of adjustment that is not immediately corrected. Your mind drifts to the idea of silence, not the peaceful quiet of the early morning, but something more controlled. Voices here are lower conversations, brief and functional. There is little of the casual exchange you noticed in the market. A council decree proves that captives were often redistributed across the empire, assigned to work where they were needed most. It was a system designed for efficiency, ensuring that conquered populations contributed directly to the strength of the state. You watch as one figure adjusts their grip slightly, the movement small but necessary. Another glances briefly to the side before lowering their gaze again, returning to the path ahead. A curious footnote in ancient records mentions that some captives were trained in specialized skills, becoming craftsmen or workers in specific trades. It is a detail that complicates the picture, suggesting variation within a system that might otherwise seem uniform. The street bends, revealing a larger open space where several groups are gathered. Some are unloading materials from carts, stacking them carefully along the edges. Others are engaged in repetitive tasks, their movements synchronized not by choice, but by necessity. For a moment, it feels as though time moves differently here, slower, heavier. Scholars bicker over the exact conditions experienced by these individuals. Some argue that treatment varied widely depending on the type of work and the attitudes of those in charge. Others suggest that the system itself imposed consistent limitations regardless of circumstance. As you observe the careful, measured movements around you, the truth seems difficult to separate. A figure stands apart, watching, not participating, not speaking, just observing with a steady gaze. The presence is unmistakable, authority without movement. One scandalous aside from historical accounts hints that resistance did occur, though often in subtle forms. Delays, mistakes, small acts that might go unnoticed in the larger system. It is a reminder that even within strict control, human will does not simply disappear. You step closer to the edge of the space, careful not to interfere. The ground here is harder, more compacted, bearing the marks of repeated labor. It feels different beneath your feet, less forgiving. The air is warmer, the shadows thinner as the sun continues its climb. You notice the details, hands roughened by work, clothing worn thin at the edges, movements that conserve energy, avoiding any excess. And yet there is also precision. The stacks of materials are arranged carefully aligned with a quiet sense of order. The tasks, though repetitive, are carried out with attention. It is not chaos, it is controlled effort. No agreement has been reached on how integrated captives became over time within Assyrian society. Some scholars suggest that certain individuals could eventually gain a degree of stability or even improved status. Others believe that the boundaries remained firm, limiting any significant change. As you watch the steady rhythm of work, the question feels distant, difficult to answer from this single moment. A faint breeze passes through, lifting dust into the air before settling again. It carries no scent of herbs or food, only the dryness of the ground and the faint trace of labor. You find yourself standing still for a moment, absorbing the scene. The empire you have been moving through reveals another layer. Not the disciplined soldiers, not the careful merchants, not the quiet households, but the labor that fills the spaces between. Records confirm that large-scale construction projects, including city walls and palaces, often relied on this kind of workforce. The visible grandeur of the empire rests in part on these unseen efforts. You take a slow breath, the air warm and dry in your lungs. Then gently you step back. The sounds follow you as you leave the space. the soft thud of materials being placed, the low murmur of instruction, the steady, unbroken rhythm of work. It does not call out. It does not demand attention. It simply continues. And as you return to the broader streets, the weight of it remains quiet but undeniable, shaping your understanding of what this warrior empire truly rests upon. The weight of that labor lingers as you step back into a busier street, yet the rhythm shifts again almost immediately. The air feels lighter here, though no less purposeful. Voices rise and fall in more varied tones, and the scent of clay returns sharper now, mixed with something faintly damp. For a moment, it feels as though you are moving into a place where memory itself is being shaped. You follow the sound of scratching, soft but persistent, until it draws you toward a shaded courtyard partially enclosed by low walls. Inside, several figures sit cross-legged on woven mats, their attention fixed on small clay tablets held carefully in their hands. Scribes. You pause at the edge, watching. Their movements are precise, almost delicate. One man presses a stylus into the surface of the clay, lifting and placing it again with steady rhythm. Each mark is small, angled, forming patterns that repeat and vary across the tablet. Records confirm that the Assyrians used cuneiform writing, a system of wedge-shaped marks impressed into clay to record everything from administrative accounts to legal contracts and royal decrees. It is not casual writing. It is deliberate, methodical. Your mind drifts to the idea of permanence. Words pressed into clay, dried and stored. Information made physical, held in a form that can endure. A council decree proves that scribes were essential to the functioning of the empire, managing records that allowed officials to track resources, taxes, and communications across vast distances. Without them, the structure you have been observing would begin to loosen. You step a little closer, careful not to disturb the quiet focus of the space. The air here carries a faint earthy scent, the smell of damp clay mixed with dust. It is grounding, almost calming. You notice how the light filters in from above, casting soft shadows that move gently as the sun shifts. One scribe pauses, lifting his stylus and examining the tablet. His eyes move across the lines, checking each mark. Then, with a slight adjustment, he continues. A curious footnote in historical records suggests that becoming a scribe required years of training, often beginning in childhood, much like the boys you saw earlier learning to handle a staff. The repetition, the discipline, the careful shaping of skill. It echoes across different roles within the empire. You watch as another scribe smooths the surface of a fresh tablet, preparing it for use. His hands move with familiarity, shaping the clay into a flat, even surface before setting it down. Scholars bicker over how widespread literacy was in Assyrian society. Some argue that reading and writing were limited to a specialized class tightly controlled. Others suggest that certain forms of basic literacy may have reached beyond official scribes, though likely in limited ways. As you observe the focused work here, it feels like a skill not easily shared. A young apprentice sits nearby, his posture slightly less steady than the others. He watches closely, mimicking the movements he sees. His stylus hesitates for a fraction of a second before pressing into the clay, leaving a mark that is just slightly uneven. He pauses, glances at the more experienced scribe beside him, then corrects himself. One scandalous aside from ancient accounts hints that scribes, despite their disciplined training, sometimes inserted small personal touches into their work, subtle variations, or even quiet commentary hidden within the text. It is a strange thought, a private voice within an official record. You lean slightly closer, though the marks remain unreadable to you. Still, there is something compelling in their pattern, the repetition of shapes forming something structured, meaningful. In your ears, the soft tapping of stylus against clay becomes almost rhythmic, a quiet counterpoint to the louder sounds of the city beyond the walls. No agreement has been reached on how much autonomy scribes truly had in their roles. Some scholars believe they were strictly bound to record information as dictated with little room for deviation. Others suggest that their position gave them a certain level of influence, shaping how information was preserved and presented. As one scribe carefully aligns his tablet with others stacked nearby, you sense the importance of order here, not just in what is written, but in how it is organized, stored, and accessed. The stacks of tablets grow slowly, each one adding to a larger system of knowledge. Records confirm that Assyrian libraries, such as the one later assembled by King Ashurbanipal, contained thousands of these tablets, preserving texts on a wide range of subjects. Though you stand in a smaller space, the principle is the same. Information collected, arranged, maintained. You notice how the scribes rarely speak. When they do, it is brief, quiet, focused on the task at hand. There is no need for extended conversation. The work itself demands attention. A faint breeze moves through the courtyard, stirring a small amount of dust that settles quickly onto the surfaces around you. One scribe brushes it away gently, careful not to disturb the marks beneath. For a moment, it feels as though time itself slows in this space. Each movement deliberate, each mark intentional. You step back slightly, allowing the scene to continue, without your presence pressing too closely. The city's broader rhythm calls again, faint but persistent beyond the walls. And yet you carry with you the awareness that here in these quiet motions, the empire is being recorded. Not in stone like the reliefs you touched, not in action like the soldiers you observed, but in words, pressed into clay, held in place, waiting. As you turn to leave, the soft tapping continues behind you, steady and unbroken. A different kind of strength, a different kind of control. One that does not rely on force, but on memory, and the careful act of preserving it. The soft tapping of stylus against clay fades as you step away from the scribe's courtyard, though its rhythm lingers faintly in your thoughts. It is replaced gradually by a different kind of stillness, not quiet in sound, but in feeling, a subtle tightening as though the city is drawing a line you are about to cross. For a moment, it feels as though every step is being weighed. The street ahead is wider but less crowded. The people who move through it carry themselves with a certain caution. Their voices, when they speak, are lower, their gestures more restrained. Even the air seems to hold a quiet expectation. You follow the path until you reach a building that stands apart. Its entrance is plain, almost severe, with little of the carved decoration you saw near the palace. The walls are solid, unadorned, functional. There is no need here for storytelling in stone. This place serves a different purpose. Records confirm that the Assyrian legal system was highly structured, with written laws governing everything from trade disputes to family matters and criminal behavior. Standing here, you can sense that structure not in decoration, but in atmosphere. You pause just outside, listening. Voices drift from within, measured and deliberate, not raised in anger, but firm, controlled. There is a rhythm to the exchange, as though each word is placed carefully like the marks on a clay tablet. You step closer, the ground beneath your feet cooler in the shade of the building. Inside, a small group is gathered. A man stands at the center, speaking, while others listen. A scribe sits nearby, tablet in hand, recording the proceedings with steady focus. Your mind drifts to the connection between what you saw earlier and what unfolds here. Words are not just recorded, they are enforced. A council decree proves that Assyrian laws were documented and applied with an emphasis on order and consequence, ensuring that disputes could be resolved within a defined framework. It is not left to chance, not to personal interpretation alone. You watch as the man at the center gestures slightly, his tone shifting just enough to suggest emphasis. The others respond one at a time, their voices measured, their movements restrained. There is no interruption, no overlap. A curious footnote in historical records mentions that legal proceedings often relied on witness testimony and written contracts, highlighting the importance of both spoken and recorded evidence. It is a system that depends on accuracy, on memory, made visible. You shift your weight, noticing the coolness of the shaded ground compared to the warmth outside. The contrast is subtle, but it adds to the sense of separation. This space operates differently. Scholars bicker over how consistently these laws were applied across the empire. Some argue that the system maintained a high degree of uniformity, reinforcing central authority. Others suggest that local variations and personal influence could affect outcomes, creating differences in practice. As you observe the careful exchange unfolding before you, the question feels distant. In this moment, the process appears steady, controlled, almost inevitable. One figure steps forward, speaking briefly. The others listen. The scribe records. Then silence. A decision is reached, though you do not hear it clearly. You sense it in the shift of posture, the slight release of tension. The man who spoke first lowers his gaze, nodding once before stepping back. One scandalous aside from ancient texts hints that punishments under Assyrian law could be severe, designed not only to correct behavior, but to deter others. The details are not spoken here, but the awareness of consequence hangs quietly in the air. You notice how no one lingers once the matter is resolved. The group disperses with quiet efficiency, each person returning to their path without delay. No agreement has been reached on how ordinary people perceive this system. Some scholars suggest it provided a sense of stability, a clear set of expectations. Others believe it may have inspired fear, the weight of potential punishment shaping behavior. As one man passes by you, his expression neutral, his steps steady, you wonder what he feels. Relief, acceptance, something more complex. The scribe remains carefully finishing the final marks on the tablet before setting it aside with others. The stack grows slowly, each piece adding to the record of decisions made. Records confirm that such documentation allowed for a degree of continuity, ensuring that rulings could be referenced and maintained over time. It is a form of memory that supports order. You take a slow breath, the air cooler here, touched by the shade and the stillness of the space. Then you step back outside. The sunlight greets you again, warmer now, the brightness sharper against your eyes. The sounds of the city return more fully, filling the space left by the controlled quiet within. Yet something remains, a sense of boundaries, of rules that shape movement and interaction, whether seen or unseen. As you walk away, the building fades behind you, its plain walls giving little hint of the weight carried within. But you know now, in the city, order is not just suggested. It is defined, measured, recorded, and when necessary, enforced. The rhythm of the streets continues unchanged on the surface, but beneath it, you can feel the structure holding firm, guiding each step, each word, each decision. Always. The brightness of the street softens as you turn again, guided not by sound this time, but by a faint shift in the air. There is something different ahead, a quiet weight, less rigid than the legal space you just left, yet no less powerful. For a moment, it feels as though the city is holding its breath. The scent reaches you first. Incense, not strong, not overwhelming, but steady. It drifts through the warm air in thin strands, mixing with the familiar dust and sun-baked clay. There is a sweetness to it, a deliberate contrast to the harsher sense of labor and metal you have passed through. You follow it. The street widens into an open approach lined with low structures that give way to something larger ahead. The building rises gradually, its form more complex than those around it, its entrance framed not by scenes of conquest, but by symbols you do not fully understand. This is a temple. You slow your steps without meaning to. Records confirm that religion played a central role in Assyrian life, with temples dedicated to gods who were believed to influence everything from harvests to warfare. Among them, the god Ashur stood above the rest, closely tied to the authority of the king himself. You feel that connection here, though. No one speaks it aloud. Figures move quietly across the open space. Their steps are measured, their voices low. Some carry small offerings. Others simply pass through, pausing briefly before continuing on. There is no rush, no urgency, only presence. Your mind drifts to the idea of balance. The soldiers, the laws, the markets, the fields, all of it held together by something that cannot be touched yet shapes everything. A council decree proves that temples were not only places of worship, but also centers of administration and economic activity, managing land resources and labor. It is a different kind of power, less visible but deeply rooted. You approach the entrance, the stone beneath your feet, smoother here, worn by countless steps. The air cools slightly as you cross into the shaded threshold, the scent of incense growing more distinct. Inside, the light dims. It filters through narrow openings, casting soft patterns across the floor. The walls rise around you, their surfaces marked with carvings that feel different from the palace reliefs, less focused on conquest, more on symbols and figures that seem to exist beyond the everyday world. For a moment, it feels as though time slows. A figure stands near the center, dressed differently from those you have seen outside. Their clothing is layered, their posture composed. They move with a quiet confidence, their gestures deliberate. A priest. Records confirm that priests in Assyria were responsible for maintaining rituals, interpreting signs, and serving as intermediaries between the people and the gods. Their role is not separate from the rest of life. It is woven into it. You watch as the priest lifts a small vessel, pouring a thin stream of liquid onto a stone surface. The motion is slow, controlled, accompanied by words spoken softly, almost too quiet to hear. The sound blends with the faint crackle of burning incense, creating a rhythm that feels both distant and immediate. A curious footnote in ancient texts suggests that offerings could range from simple food items to more elaborate gifts, depending on the occasion and the status of those involved. It is a system that reflects both belief and hierarchy. Your hand brushes lightly against a nearby column. The stone is cooler here, its surface smoother, shaped by careful craftsmanship. You feel the subtle grooves left by tools, the faint imperfections that remind you it was made by human hands. Scholars bicker over how deeply ordinary people believed in the power of these rituals. Some argue that faith was central, guiding decisions and providing comfort. Others suggest that participation may have been as much about tradition and expectation as personal conviction. As you watch a small group approach the altar, each pausing briefly before placing their offering, the question feels less important. The act itself carries meaning. One scandalous, aside from historical accounts, hints that priests, like any group, were not immune to influence and ambition, with some using their position to gain power or resources. It is a quiet reminder that even within sacred spaces, human nature remains. You step further inside the air cooler, still the light softer. The sounds of the city fade almost completely, replaced by the gentle echo of movement within the temple. A footstep, a whispered phrase, the faint rustle of fabric. No agreement has been reached on how much control temples exerted over daily life beyond their religious functions. Some scholars suggest they were deeply integrated into governance and economy. Others believe their influence, while significant, operated alongside other forms of authority. As the priest completes the ritual and lowers the vessel, there is a brief stillness, a pause. Then quietly the movement resumes. You take a slow breath, the scent of incense settling into your senses. There is something calming here, despite the weight of belief and expectation. A sense of order that does not rely on force, but on repetition and shared understanding. As you turn to leave, the light grows brighter again near the entrance, the warmth of the sun waiting just beyond. You step back outside. The city greets you once more, its sounds returning gradually, its rhythm unchanged. And yet you carry something with you, an awareness that beneath the structure of laws and the discipline of soldiers, there is another layer, one that cannot be seen as easily, but is felt. In scent, in silence, in the quiet space where people pause, even if only for a moment, to acknowledge something greater than themselves. The scent of incense lingers faintly as you move away from the temple, threading through the warmer air of the street, like a memory that refuses to fully fade. The city's rhythm returns steady and layered, but something about it now feels more deliberate, as if every sound carries a hidden meaning. For a moment, it feels as though you are listening more closely than before. You follow a quieter path that branches away from the main thoroughfare, drawn by a low murmur that seems different from ordinary conversation, softer, slower, measured in a way that feels almost ceremonial. The space you enter is not as grand as the temple, but it holds its own gravity. A small courtyard opens before you, partially shaded its center, marked by a low table upon which rests a collection of objects. Bowls, small figures, a shallow dish filled with what appears to be oil. The air here carries a sharper scent, something herbal mixed with the faint trace of smoke. A figure stands beside the table, their posture calm, their movements precise. You pause, instinctively quiet. Records confirm that Assyrians placed great importance on divination, believing that the gods communicated through signs, omens, and patterns that could be interpreted by trained specialists. This is one of those moments. The figure leans slightly forward, examining the surface of the oil in the shallow dish. Their gaze is steady, focused, not on the object itself, but on something within it, or perhaps beyond it. Your mind drifts to the idea of seeing without looking. A council decree proves that diviners held official roles within the Assyrian court, advising the king on important decisions based on their interpretations of omens. This practice is not separate from governance. It is part of it. You step closer, careful not to disturb the stillness. The surface of the oil catches the light, reflecting it in subtle patterns. The figure tilts the dish slightly, watching how the reflection shifts. There is no rush in the movement, no impatience, only attention. A curious footnote in ancient records mentions that divination methods varied widely, including the reading of animal entrails, the observation of celestial events, and the interpretation of dreams. It is a complex system, one that seeks meaning in many forms. As the figure continues their observation, you notice a second person nearby, seated and waiting. Their hands rest lightly in their lap, their posture composed but not relaxed. There is a quiet tension in the stillness. Scholars bicker over how seriously these practices were taken by those outside the ruling elite. Some argue that belief in omens was widespread, shaping everyday decisions. Others suggest that while the rituals were respected, their deeper interpretations remained the domain of specialists. You watch as the standing figure finally speaks. The words are low measured, delivered without emphasis. The seated individual listens closely, nodding once as the explanation unfolds. There is no visible reaction beyond that small gesture, yet the weight of the exchange is clear. One scandalous, aside from historical accounts, hints that conflicting interpretations of omens could lead to disagreements even among trained diviners. It is a reminder that certainty, even when sought carefully, is not always guaranteed. The figure adjusts one of the objects on the table, aligning it slightly before stepping back. The movement feels complete, as though a process has reached its conclusion. You notice how the space itself contributes to the experience. The partial shade, the controlled light, the quiet separation from the busier streets. Everything here seems designed to focus attention inward, to reduce distraction. No agreement has been reached on how much influence diviners truly held over major decisions. Some scholars suggest their interpretations could significantly shape actions, particularly at the highest levels of power. Others believe their role, while respected, operated alongside more practical considerations. As the seated individual rises, offering a brief acknowledgement before departing, you sense that whatever was sought has been received, even if its meaning remains unseen to you. The standing figure begins to gather the objects, their movements unhurried, returning each item to its place. There is a sense of routine here, of repeated practice, refined over time. You take a slow breath, noticing the layered scents once more. Oil, herbs, faint smoke. They settle gently, creating an atmosphere that feels both grounded and distant. In your ears, the quiet returns, punctuated only by the soft movements within the courtyard. For a moment, it feels as though you are standing at the edge of something intangible, a space where decisions are shaped not only by visible factors, but by patterns, interpreted meanings drawn from subtle shifts and signs. Records confirm that the Assyrian state often consulted such practices before major actions, including military campaigns. It is a reminder that even in a society defined by strength and order, uncertainty remains. You step back slowly, allowing the space to close behind you. The sounds of the city begin to return, filling the quiet with familiar rhythms. Voices, footsteps, the distant creak of movement. Yet the stillness of the courtyard lingers in your mind, a place where time slows, where attention narrows, where meaning is sought in the smallest of details. As you turn and continue along the street, you carry with you the sense that not everything in this empire is decided by force or law. Some things are guided by signs, interpreted, weighed carefully, and followed even when their meaning is not fully understood. The quiet weight of the courtyard fades slowly as you return to the wider street, but something about your pace has changed. You move a little more slowly now, as if the idea of unseen forces and hidden meanings has settled into your thoughts. The city continues steady and structured, yet for a moment it feels as though there is something beneath it all, something less visible but just as present. You turn down a shaded path where the noise softens again, though not completely. A faint breeze carries the scent of dry clay mixed with something older, almost stale. It is not unpleasant, just different, heavier. For a moment, it feels as though you are approaching a place where time gathers rather than passes. The space opens into a quiet area set slightly apart from the busier streets. The ground here is uneven, marked by low mounds and simple stone markers. Some are worn smooth, others lean slightly, their edges softened by years of wind and dust. A burial ground. You slow instinctively. Records confirm that Assyrians practiced burial rituals that varied depending on status, with many individuals interred beneath or near their homes, while others were placed in designated areas like this. Death was not distant. It remained close to daily life. You step carefully between the markers, the ground shifting slightly beneath your feet. The air feels still here, the sounds of the city muted as though held at a distance. Your mind drifts to the idea of continuation, not in the visible sense, but in belief. A council decree proves that offerings to the dead were expected, ensuring that spirits remained at peace and did not disturb the living. It is not simply remembrance, it is maintenance of balance. You notice small objects placed near some of the markers, fragments of pottery, simple offerings, items left with intention, though their original form may have faded. A curious footnote in ancient texts suggests that the Assyrians believed the afterlife to be a shadowy existence, where the dead continued in a diminished form dependent on the offerings and remembrance of the living. It is not a vision of grandeur. It is quieter, more restrained. You pause near one of the stones, its surface worn smooth. You reach out your fingers, brushing against it lightly. The texture is cool, unchanged by the warmth of the sun above. Scholars bicker over how widespread these beliefs were in their exact form. Some argue that variations existed across regions and social groups. Others suggest a shared understanding shaped by tradition and ritual. As you stand there, the specifics feel less important than the presence itself. The awareness that life here does not end cleanly. It lingers. One scandalous, aside from historical accounts, hints that neglected spirits were believed to cause misfortune leading to illness or disturbances within the household. It is a reminder that care for the dead was not only about respect, but also about maintaining stability among the living. A faint sound reaches you. Footsteps. You turn slightly to see a figure approaching, carrying a small container. Their movements are slow, deliberate. They kneel near one of the markers, placing the container carefully before lowering their head for a moment. There is no dramatic gesture, no spoken words that you can hear, just a quiet act. The breeze shifts, carrying the scent of dry earth, and something faintly sweet, perhaps, from the contents of the offering. It lingers briefly before dispersing. No agreement has been reached on how individuals personally felt about these rituals. Some scholars suggest genuine belief and emotional connection. Others propose that tradition and expectation played a significant role, guiding behavior regardless of personal conviction. As the figure rises and steps away, their expression remains composed, their movements unchanged. You watch them leave, then turn your attention back to the space around you. The markers, the offerings, the stillness. For a moment, it feels as though the city has paused here, holding a different kind of rhythm. Slower, quieter, more reflective. Records confirm that the Assyrians maintained strong connections between the living and the dead, with rituals designed to ensure harmony between both realms. It is not separation, but continuation in a different form. You take a slow breath, the air cooler here despite the growing warmth of the day. Then gently you step back. The ground shifts slightly beneath your feet as you move away from the markers, returning toward the path that leads back into the city's flow. The sounds begin to return. Voices, movement, the steady rhythm of life continuing. Yet something remains with you, a sense of depth beneath the surface, that beneath the structure of empire, the discipline, the order there, is also this, a quiet acknowledgement of what comes after. Not grand, not loud, but steady, present. As you step fully back into the street, the burial ground fades behind you, its stillness giving way to the familiar motion of the city. And you carry with you the understanding that in this place life and death are not separate paths. They move alongside one another, always. The stillness of the burial ground lingers faintly in your thoughts as you step back into the warmer flow of the city. The contrast is immediate. Life presses forward again, steady and unbroken, as if the quiet space you just left exists slightly out of reach of everything else. For a moment, it feels as though your senses sharpen. A different scent draws your attention now. Warm grain, roasted, slightly nutty. You follow it without thinking, turning down a side street where the sound of voices grows softer, replaced by the gentle crackle of fire and the low murmur of domestic activity. The air is thicker here, filled with the comforting familiarity of food being prepared. You step into a courtyard, partially open to the sky. A small group gathers around a low hearth, its flames steady, contained within a simple clay structure. A pot rests above it, its contents bubbling gently, releasing a faint, savory aroma that settles into the air. For a moment, it feels as though time slows again, though not with the weight of ritual, but with the quiet rhythm of sustenance. Records confirm that the Assyrian diet was based largely on grains, such as barley and wheat, often prepared as bread or porridge supplemented by vegetables, fruits, and occasionally meat. It is simple, but it carries the weight of daily survival. You move closer, careful not to disrupt the scene. A woman stirs the pot with slow, practiced motions, her hand steady, as she adjusts the position slightly to control the heat. The sound of the liquid shifting is soft, almost soothing, blending with the faint crackle of the fire. Your mind drifts to the idea of repetition again, not as discipline this time, but as comfort. A council decree proves that food production and distribution were closely tied to the broader economic system, with grain often collected as tax and redistributed where needed. Even something as personal as a meal connects back to the structure of the empire. You notice the small details. A basket of flatbread resting nearby, its surface slightly uneven, the edges darker where it has been baked. A handful of dried herbs laid out carefully, ready to be added at the right moment. Oddly enough, ancient texts mention the use of beer as a common drink often made from barley and consumed daily by many people. It is not the strong beverage you might imagine, but something lighter, more nourishing. A curious footnote suggests that beer was sometimes consumed through straws to avoid sediment, an oddly specific detail that brings a quiet sense of familiarity to the scene. You watch as a small bowl is filled and passed to another person, the exchange smooth, unspoken. There is no ceremony, no pause, just the continuation of a shared routine. Scholars bicker over how much variety existed in the Assyrian diet across different regions and social classes. Some argue that access to certain foods was limited by status and geography. Others suggest that trade networks introduced a broader range of ingredients than might be expected. As you observe the simple meal before you, the question feels less important than the act itself. Food prepared, food shared, food sustaining. One scandalous aside from historical accounts hints that food shortages, when they occurred, could lead to unrest, particularly in urban areas where dependence on supply chains was greater. It is a reminder that even this quiet scene exists within a larger, more fragile system. The breeze shifts, carrying the scent of the cooking more strongly for a moment. It wraps around you, warm and grounding, before dispersing again. You feel the heat of the fire on your skin, a gentle contrast to the open air above. The light filters down, catching on the edges of the pot, the movement of hands, the surface of the bread. No agreement has been reached on how communal meals were across different households. Some scholars suggest that eating together was a central part of daily life, reinforcing social bonds. Others believe that practices varied widely depending on circumstance. As one person tears a piece of bread and dips it into the pot, you sense the quiet connection in the action, not spoken, not emphasized, but present. Records confirm that meals were often simple, but regular, providing structure to the day and a moment of pause within the broader demands of work and obligation. You take a slow breath, letting the warmth and scent settle. For a moment, it feels as though this is the center of something, not power, not authority, but continuity. The fire burns steadily. The pot simmers. The hands move with practiced ease. You step back slightly, allowing the scene to continue without your presence pressing too close. The sounds of the city begin to return more clearly as you move toward the edge of the courtyard. Voices, footsteps, the distant rhythm of work. Yet the warmth of this space lingers with you, a reminder that even within a warrior empire, life is sustained not just by strength or order, but by these quiet, repeated acts. Preparing, sharing, continuing. As you step back into the street, the scent fades, gradually replaced by the broader mix of the city. But the memory remains soft, steady, enough. The warmth of the hearth fades behind you, but it leaves a faint echo in your senses, like the memory of heat still resting on your skin. As you move forward, the city feels slightly more exposed again, the streets opening wider, the sounds growing sharper, more varied. For a moment, it feels as though the rhythm of daily life is shifting its tone once more. You turn into a street where light spills more directly across the ground. The buildings here are taller, their upper levels catching the sun, while the lower sections remain in cool shadow. The contrast draws your attention upward. Then you notice them. Rows of textiles hanging from wooden frames, gently shifting in the breeze. Fabrics of varying colors and textures, some rough and practical, others finer and more carefully woven. The movement is subtle, almost hypnotic. You slow your steps. Records confirm that textile production was a major industry in Assyrian society, with wool being one of the most important materials used for clothing trade and taxation. Standing here, you can see why. This is not just fabric. It is structure, identity made visible. A woman stands near one of the displays, adjusting a length of cloth with careful hands. She smooths it down, then steps back slightly, assessing how it catches the light. Her movements are precise, almost thoughtful. Your mind drifts to the idea of appearance, not vanity, but communication. A council decree proves that clothing and adornment were often linked to social status, profession, and wealth, with specific materials and designs associated with different roles within society. What you wear is not random. It speaks before you do. You reach out gently toward a hanging fabric, not touching it fully, just feeling the air. It disturbs as it sways slightly. The weave is visible even from here, tight and consistent. Oddly enough, archaeological evidence suggests that Assyrian textiles were highly valued in trade networks, sometimes traveling far beyond the empire itself. Something so ordinary here becomes something desirable elsewhere. A curious footnote mentions that dyeing techniques allowed for a range of colors, though certain shades were more costly to produce, often reserved for higher status individuals. It is a quiet hierarchy expressed through color and texture. You notice a man nearby examining a piece of fabric more closely. He runs his fingers lightly across it, testing its weight and quality. The exchange that follows is brief but focused. A nod, a gesture, a decision made without extended negotiation. Scholars bicker over how standardized textile production was across the empire. Some argue for centralized control in certain regions, especially those supplying the royal household. Others suggest a more decentralized system with local workshops adapting techniques to available resources. As you continue walking, the fabrics shift around you like a slow-moving landscape, some coarse and plain, others finely patterned, each one representing time, labor, and skill. One scandalous, aside from historical accounts, hints that textile production was often labor-intensive, with much of the work likely carried out within households or workshops staffed by women and dependents. It is a reminder that behind every visible product lies an extended chain of effort. The breeze picks up slightly, lifting a few loose threads from a hanging cloth. They flutter briefly before settling again. You pause near another display, noticing a deeper red fabric that catches the sunlight in a different way. It feels richer, denser. The woman beside it notices your attention, but says nothing, simply adjusting its position slightly. No agreement has been reached on how widely luxury textiles were distributed beyond elite circles. Some scholars suggest strict limitations based on status. Others believe trade and reuse allowed for broader access than official systems might imply. As you stand there, you begin to notice how clothing shapes perception in subtle ways. Not only how people see each other, but how they are seen. Records confirm that garments were often reused, repaired, and passed down, making them part of a longer cycle of use rather than disposable items. Even here, continuity plays a role. A faint sound of weaving or loom work drifts from somewhere nearby, rhythmic and steady. You cannot see the source, but you can imagine it, the repetitive motion of hands guiding thread into pattern over and over again. For a moment, it feels as though time itself is being woven, not in grand events, but in small repeated actions. You take a step back, letting the space expand around you once more. The fabrics continue to sway gently, their movement subtle but constant, responding to the breeze like a shared breath. The city's broader noise returns, gradually layering itself back in. Voices, footsteps, the distant calls of trade and movement. Yet the visual rhythm of the textiles remains with you, a quiet reminder that identity here is not only spoken or recorded. It is worn. It is shaped. It is displayed. And as you turn away from the street of fabrics, the colors slowly recede behind you, blending once more into the larger pattern of the city. The colors of the textiles fade behind you, replaced once again by the muted tones of sun-baked stone and dust. Yet something about them lingers in your vision like after-images that refuse to disappear completely. The city feels slightly different now, as though you are beginning to notice not just what people do, but where they do it. For a moment, it feels as though the streets themselves are guiding you inward. You turn down a narrower lane where the noise softens and the light becomes more fragmented, filtered through upper floors that jut slightly over the path. The walls here are closer together, their surfaces worn in places by repeated contact, softened by time. You notice doorways. Some open, some closed, each one slightly different, yet sharing a common structure. Low thresholds, modest entrances, narrow passages leading inward. There is a rhythm to them, a repetition that suggests familiarity rather than display. You step closer to one that stands partially open. Inside the space is dimmer, cooler. The air carries a faint scent of clay-woven fibers and something faintly smelly like a hearth that has recently been used. Records confirm that Assyrian homes varied in size depending on wealth and status, but many followed a similar structural pattern centered around courtyards that provided light ventilation and space for daily activity. Even before you see it fully, you can sense that structure unfolding inward. You move inside carefully, allowing your eyes to adjust. A small courtyard lies at the center, open to the sky above. Light falls into it in a soft column illuminating the ground where daily life quietly gathers. Rooms branch off from it in simple arrangement, their entrances framed by low walls. Your mind drifts to the idea of privacy. Not isolation, but containment. A council decree proves that household structures often reflected broader social organization, with family units forming the core of residential life, supported by dependents and workers depending on status. The home is not just shelter, it is a system. A woman passes through the courtyard carrying a folded piece of cloth. She moves with familiarity, her steps unhurried, as though she has crossed this space countless times. She does not pause when she sees you, only adjusts her path slightly before continuing. You remain still, observing without intruding. A curious footnote in archaeological records suggests that some homes contained storage areas for grain, tools, and household goods, reinforcing the idea that domestic spaces were also centers of production and management. It is not just living, it is organizing life itself. You notice a low bench near one wall, its surface worn smooth by use. A child sits nearby, tracing patterns in the dust with a small stick. The motion is absent-minded, repetitive, absorbed in its own rhythm. Scholars bicker over how much autonomy individuals within households actually experienced in their daily routines. Some argue that strict family hierarchies defined movement and responsibility. Others suggest that within those structures, individuals still carved out personal space and habits. As you watch the small courtyard, the answer feels layered rather than singular. A man enters from one of the side rooms, pausing briefly at the threshold before stepping into the light. He carries a small container which he sets down near the center before exchanging a brief glance with the woman. No words are spoken. The exchange is enough. One scandalous, aside from historical accounts, hints at disputes within households over inheritance, labor, and resource allocation, suggesting that even within the home negotiation was sometimes necessary. The city's order does not erase internal complexity. You take a slow breath, noticing how the temperature shifts slightly between shadow and sun within the courtyard. The movement of air is subtle, but present, carrying faint traces of food cloth and earth. For a moment, it feels as though the house is breathing. Records confirm that domestic spaces were often multifunctional, serving as sites for cooking, weaving, storage, and social interaction. Everything overlaps here. There are no strict separations between roles and spaces. You glance toward one of the interior rooms partially visible through a narrow opening. Inside, shelves line the wall holding objects you cannot fully distinguish. The arrangement is orderly, intentional. No agreement has been reached on how rigid domestic hierarchies were across different regions or classes. Some scholars suggest strong consistency in structure. Others argue for more flexibility shaped by local conditions and family dynamics. As the child in the courtyard pauses briefly looking up toward the sky, then returns to their patterns in the dust, you notice how time feels slower here. Not paused, but stretched, measured by small actions rather than large events. The woman returns briefly, adjusting something near the edge of the courtyard before disappearing again into one of the interior rooms. Her movements are efficient, familiar, unremarkable in their repetition, and yet they hold the space together. You begin to understand that this is its own kind of architecture, not made of stone alone, but of routines, of roles, of repeated actions that structure the flow of each day. As you step back toward the entrance, the light shifts again, brighter now against your eyes. The street outside feels wider once more, louder, less contained. But the impression of the courtyard remains with you, a quiet system within the larger system, a place where life is not displayed, but lived. The doorway of the household fades behind you, but its contained rhythm still sits quietly in your awareness, like a small room you can still feel even after you've left it. As you step back into the street, the contrast feels sharper than before. The city no longer feels like a single continuous space, but a layered one, each part holding its own logic. For a moment, it feels as though the ground beneath you is stretching outward. You follow the flow of movement toward a broader avenue, one that carries more traffic than the narrow lanes behind you. Carts pass with heavier loads, and the sound of wheels rolling over packed earth becomes more frequent, more insistent. This is not a place you stay still in. It is a place you pass through. Records confirm that Assyrian cities were deeply connected by a network of roads and communication routes, allowing goods, messages, and officials to move efficiently across vast distances of the empire. Standing here, you can sense that connectivity not as a map, but as motion. You turn your head slightly as a messenger passes. He moves quickly, but not chaotically. His pace is deliberate, his posture forward-leaning as though shaped by urgency that has been refined into discipline. A small satchel hangs at his side, secured tightly. Your mind drifts to the idea of connection, not just between places, but between decisions. A council decree proves that administrative messages were often carried by appointed couriers, ensuring that instructions from central authorities reached distant regions without delay. It is a system built on trust in movement itself. You step aside as a cart approaches its wooden frame, creaking softly under weight. The driver calls out briefly, not in alarm, but in warning, guiding others out of its path. The interaction is brief, almost automatic. Oddly enough, archaeological evidence suggests that road maintenance was an ongoing concern with labor a sign to keep routes clear and usable across seasons. It is a reminder that even movement requires upkeep. A curious footnote in ancient records mentions that some routes were marked with way stations, offering rest and resources for travelers and officials. These are not random paths. They are structured channels of flow. You continue walking, noticing how the street subtly directs movement rather than simply allowing it. The architecture shifts again. Buildings here are less residential, more functional. Storage spaces, workshops, small offices where goods are recorded or redistributed, doors open frequently, people entering and exiting in steady cycles. Scholars bicker over how centralized control of trade and communication truly was in practice. Some argue for a highly organized system tightly managed by officials. Others suggest that local autonomy played a significant role in keeping things moving smoothly. As you watch a brief exchange between two figures near a doorway, a bundle changing hands with minimal conversation, the reality feels like a blend of both. Structure guiding flow, people filling in the gaps. One scandalous, aside from historical accounts, hints that delays in communication could have serious consequences, especially in military or administrative contexts where timing was critical. It is a quiet pressure that sits behind every movement you see here. You pause near a post where several paths intersect. The space feels like a convergence point where movement gathers before dispersing again in different directions. It is not marked by ceremony, but by repetition. People pause briefly, orient themselves, then continue. No agreement has been reached on how standardized these routes and systems were across the empire. Some scholars believe in a high degree of uniformity enforced from the center. Others suggest adaptation to geography and local conditions played a larger role than often assumed. As you observe the steady rhythm of passage, the question feels less important than the effect. Things move, information moves, people move, and the system continues. A faint sound draws your attention upward for a moment. The call of a distant signal, perhaps from a guard post or messenger station further along the route. It is not loud, but it carries clearly through the air, cutting briefly across the ambient noise. Then it fades. You notice how quickly everything returns to its steady flow. Records confirm that empires of this scale depended not only on military strength, but on communication networks that allowed coordination across vast and diverse regions. Without them, structure would weaken. You take a slow breath, feeling the movement of the street around you. It is not chaotic, but it is not still either. It exists in motion continuously, adjusting, responding, redirecting. As a group of travelers passes by, carrying supplies bound for somewhere beyond your view, you watch them for a moment before stepping aside. They do not pause. They do not hesitate. They continue forward, along a path you can no longer see. And in that simple continuation, you begin to understand something subtle. In this empire, distance is not emptiness. It is connection stretched outward, held together not by proximity, but by movement that never fully stops. The flow of travelers continues past you, then gradually thins as the street widens into a more open stretch. The sense of constant motion remains, but it softens slightly like a current easing after a narrow passage. You find yourself walking at a steadier pace, now less pulled by individual sounds and more aware of the system beneath them. For a moment, it feels as though the city is speaking in signals rather than voices. You notice small clusters of activity along the road. A figure standing near a post watching the movement of carts. another adjusting a bundle of goods before sending it onward. There is a rhythm here that feels coordinated even when no single person appears to be directing it openly. Records confirm that Assyrian administrative systems relied on a combination of officials, local agents, and messengers to maintain communication across the empire, ensuring that decisions made in one place could be carried out in another. You are no longer just observing movement. You are seeing coordination in motion. A messenger passes again this time, slowing briefly at a junction. He exchanges a quick gesture with another figure before continuing along a different route. The interaction is brief, almost silent, yet clearly meaningful. Your mind drifts to the idea of instruction carried across distance, not spoken directly, but transferred. A council decree proves that written orders and sealed messages were used extensively to maintain control and consistency, especially when dealing with distant provinces. Authority here does not remain in one place. It travels. You step closer to the edge of the road, noticing how the surface has been worn into subtle grooves by repeated passage. The earth is compacted, shaped by use rather than design. Each cart, each footstep contributes to the formation of this path. Oddly enough, archaeological findings suggest that seals and tokens were often used to verify authenticity in communication and trade, acting as early forms of identification and authorization. It is a system built on recognition and trust in structure. A curious footnote mentions that couriers sometimes carried not only messages, but symbolic objects representing authority, ensuring that instructions were accepted even in distant regions. It is communication reinforced by presence even when physical distance remains. You watch as another group moves through their pace, synchronized in a way that suggests familiarity with the route. They do not need to stop and orient themselves. The path is already known. Scholars bicker over how much autonomy local officials had in interpreting central instructions. Some argue that strict adherence was expected and enforced. Others suggest that flexibility was necessary for practical governance across varied regions. As you observe a brief pause, where one traveler checks a mark on a wooden post before continuing, the balance between structure and adaptation becomes visible. One scandalous aside from historical accounts hints that delays or miscommunication could sometimes lead to tension between central authority and local administrators, though such moments were rarely recorded in detail. The system is designed for clarity, but it is still human in its execution. You continue walking, noticing how the road subtly divides ahead, splitting into multiple directions, marked by faint signs or worn indicators. Each branch leads somewhere beyond your sight. The movement does not stop. It simply redistributes. No agreement has been reached on how efficient Assyrian communication systems were compared to other contemporary empires. Some scholars emphasize their effectiveness in maintaining control over large territories. Others point out the limitations imposed by distance and terrain. As another messenger passes briefly, adjusting his grip on a strap before continuing, you notice how routine the urgency appears. It is not panic, it is structure. A faint sound of hooves reaches you from further down the road, followed by the creak of a cart turning onto a different path. The sound fades quickly, absorbed into the broader rhythm. You take a moment to stand still, watching the flow continue around you. Everything here is in motion, yet nothing feels random. Each movement connects to another. Each path leads somewhere that matters. Records confirm that the strength of Assyrian governance depended heavily on maintaining these lines of communication, ensuring that orders, resources, and information could circulate without breaking the structure of the empire. You begin to see the road not just as a physical space, but as an extension of authority itself, a channel through which decisions travel, a structure that allows distance to function. As you step forward again, the movement around you continues unchanged, steady, and unbroken. But now you are more aware of what carries it. Not just people, not just carts, but a system that relies on constant motion to remain whole. And as you follow the road further, the sense of connection stretches ahead of you, always continuing just beyond what you can see. The road begins to narrow again as you move farther from the main flow, the steady rhythm of carts and messengers gradually thinning into something less structured. The air feels drier here, the dust finer, lifted in occasional swirls by passing movement. For a moment it feels as though the city is holding its breath between exchanges. You notice a change in the atmosphere before you fully understand its cause. The people here walk differently, not slower exactly, but more carefully. Their eyes are more alert, scanning the edges of the street as they pass. Conversations, when they occur, are brief and subdued. Even the sounds of movement seem more contained. You follow the street as it bends slightly upward toward a section of the city where the buildings are heavier, their walls thicker, their presence more imposing. A low structure comes into view ahead, partially enclosed, with a narrow entrance framed by stone. There are no decorations here, no reliefs, no welcoming markers, only function. Records confirm that Assyrian cities included designated spaces for detention and punishment used to enforce legal order and maintain control over the population. You slow instinctively as you approach. The air feels different at the threshold, heavier, still. You do not enter fully, but you stand close enough to see inside. The space is dim, lit only by narrow openings above. Shadows stretch unevenly across the ground. Figures move within, but not freely. Their movements are constrained, guided by others whose presence is quiet but firm. Your mind drifts immediately to structure again, but this time in its most rigid form. A council decree proves that punishments were part of the Assyrian legal system, intended not only to correct behavior, but also to reinforce the boundaries of law and authority. Order here is not abstract. It is enforced through consequence. A guard stands near the entrance, his posture unmoving. His attention is not dramatic or aggressive. It is constant, observational, the kind of watchfulness that does not need to be announced. You notice how even sound seems reduced here. Footsteps are softer, voices lower. Every movement feels measured, as though excess motion itself is discouraged. Oddly enough, some historical records suggest that Assyrian punishment practices varied depending on status, context, and the nature of the offense, though the underlying goal remained consistency in enforcing authority. It is not random, it is structured. A curious footnote mentions that administrative records sometimes included detailed accounts of legal outcomes, ensuring that consequences were documented and referenced for future cases. Even punishment is recorded, integrated into the same system you saw with scribes and laws. You take a small step back from the entrance. Inside, a brief exchange occurs between two figures. One gestures slightly, the other responds with a lowered head. The interaction is short, efficient, without visible emotion. Scholars bicker over how visible such spaces were within Assyrian cities. Some argue they were deliberately placed to serve as reminders of authority. Others suggest they were more discreet, activated only when needed. Standing here, it feels like both interpretations hold weight. One scandalous, aside from historical accounts, hints that fear of punishment may have played a significant role in maintaining order, though the extent of its use across all social levels remains debated. It is difficult to separate perception from practice. You hear a faint sound from deeper inside, not loud, not clear, just enough to register as movement within the structure. Then it fades again. The guard does not react. No agreement has been reached on how central punitive systems were to daily governance in Assyria. Some scholars emphasize their importance in maintaining stability across a vast empire. Others argue that administrative organization and economic dependence played equally significant roles in sustaining order. As you remain at the edge, you become more aware of the contrast between this space and those you have seen earlier. The markets where exchange is fluid, the fields where effort is continuous, the homes where life is contained, the scribes where order is recorded, and here where order is enforced. You take a slow breath, noticing how the air feels slightly cooler near the stone walls. A figure passes behind you on the street, pausing briefly before continuing without looking toward the structure. The avoidance is subtle but noticeable. The city does not stop. It continues around this space, but it does not merge with it in the same way. Records confirm that legal enforcement was part of a broader system designed to maintain coherence across the empire, ensuring that laws carried meaning beyond written form. You step further back, allowing the structure to recede slightly from your immediate attention. The street resumes its familiar rhythm, though more subdued than before. Movement returns. Voices return. Life continues. But something has shifted in your awareness. Not everything in this city is soft exchange, careful record, or quiet ritual. Some parts exist to define boundaries, to remind, to hold structure in place when other systems are not enough. As you turn away from the entrance, the building fades behind you, its presence still felt but no longer directly seen. And as you rejoin the flow of the street, you carry with you the understanding that in this empire, order is not only created, it is enforced, and always somewhere nearby maintained. The presence of the enforcement building lingers behind you for a few steps, like a shadow that does not quite detach from its source. But as you move forward, the city slowly reclaims its rhythm. Sound returns in layers, again softer at first, then gradually fuller, as if the world is reminding you it continues, regardless of what you have just seen. For a moment, it feels as though the city is deliberately shifting its tone. The street begins to widen once more, and the harsh edges of earlier spaces soften. You notice small groups forming at intersections, people speaking in quieter, more relaxed exchanges. The tension in posture that marked the previous area begins to ease. Yet there is still structure here, always structure. Records confirm that Assyrian society, despite its emphasis on discipline and order, included periods and spaces for communal gathering, particularly during religious or seasonal festivals that provided relief from daily obligations. You sense the faint outline of that possibility as you walk. A faint sound reaches you first. Music, not loud or theatrical, but steady, rhythmic. A simple beat carried by percussion and echoed by a stringed instrument you cannot fully see yet. It draws you forward gently like a thread through the air. You follow it. The street opens into a larger square, where movement gathers rather than disperses. People stand in clusters, some watching, others participating. At the center, a small group performs. One plays a drum, another a lyre, their motions coordinated but not rigid. For a moment, it feels as though the city is breathing differently. Your mind drifts to the idea of release, not absence of order, but temporary easing of it. A council decree proves that festivals were part of the Assyrian calendar, often linked to religious observances or agricultural cycles, allowing moments of collective participation that contrasted with the structure of daily life. You step closer to the edge of the gathering. The rhythm of the music is simple but persistent, repeating in patterns that settle easily into the body. People nearby sway slightly, some tapping their hands or feet in time, others simply watching. Oddly enough, ancient descriptions suggest that music played an important role in both ritual and social contexts, used not only for entertainment, but also to mark transitions, celebrations, and communal identity. A curious footnote mentions instruments made from wood reed and animal skin carefully crafted to produce tones that carried well in open spaces like this. It is a reminder that even sound here is shaped by material and intention. You notice a small group exchanging food and drink nearby. Their movements relaxed compared to the more formal exchanges of the market. There is laughter here, brief but genuine, quickly dissolving back into the rhythm of the moment. Scholars bicker over how frequent and widespread such festivals were across the empire. Some argue they were tightly regulated, occurring at fixed intervals under state supervision. Others suggest a more varied and locally adapted tradition that allowed communities to express identity within broader structures. As you watch the musicians, you notice how their performance subtly shifts, responding to the crowd's presence. The rhythm becomes slightly faster, then steadies again, as if guided by attention rather than strict instruction. One scandalous, aside from historical accounts, hints that such gatherings could occasionally serve as moments where social boundaries softened, though never fully disappeared. The usual hierarchies remain, but they are less visible here, less immediate. You take a slow breath, noticing how the air feels lighter in this space. The scent is different too, a mix of dust smoke and something faintly sweet perhaps from offerings or shared food. For a moment, it feels as though the city has allowed itself to soften, but only for a moment. Records confirm that even within celebratory contexts, Assyrian society maintained underlying structures of order, ensuring that gatherings remained within acceptable boundaries and did not disrupt broader stability. You shift your attention to the people around you. A man standing slightly apart watches with a composed expression, not participating but not fully detached either. A woman nearby claps softly in time with the rhythm, her focus on the performers unwavering. No agreement has been reached on how spontaneous or controlled these events truly were. Some scholars emphasize state involvement and oversight. Others suggest that communal participation naturally shaped the form these gatherings took over time. As the music continues, you notice how easily the rhythm holds attention without demanding it. It does not push. It invites. The square feels full but not crowded, present but not confined. You step a little further into the edge of the space, careful not to interrupt the flow. The sound of drums becomes slightly more pronounced here, resonating through the ground beneath your feet. For a brief moment, you close your eyes. The rhythm continues, steady, simple, repetitive, and strangely grounding. When you open them again, nothing has changed, and yet everything feels slightly realigned. The city has not stopped being structured. It has simply revealed another mode of itself. Not control, not enforcement, but shared movement, shared sound, shared pause. As you begin to step away from the square, the music continues behind you, gradually blending back into the broader soundscape of the city. It does not end. It disperses, and as you walk on, you carry that rhythm with you, still faintly echoing in your thoughts, like something that does not need to be heard to remain present. The rhythm of the music lingers faintly in your thoughts as you leave the square, dissolving gradually into the broader soundscape of the city. Yet, even as it fades, you notice something subtle has shifted in the atmosphere around you. The streets feel less rigid now, less defined by function alone. For a moment, it feels as though the city is allowing itself to remember something softer. You turn into a narrower lane again, but this one is different. The walls are marked with small openings, some partially covered, through which you catch glimpses of quieter activity. There is movement, but it is unhurried. Voices, but not directed. A faint sound reaches you. Not music this time. Stories. You follow it instinctively. The lane opens into a small, shaded area where several people are gathered. There is no formal arrangement, no clear structure to their positions. Some sit on low surfaces, others stand leaning casually against walls. At the center, one figure speaks, their voice calm and steady, carrying just enough to hold attention. You pause at the edge. For a moment, it feels as though time has softened again. Records confirm that storytelling and oral tradition played an important role in ancient Assyrian culture, preserving myths, historical accounts, and moral lessons that were passed from person to person before or alongside written forms. Your mind drifts to the idea of memory carried by voice, not recorded in clay, not carved into stone, but held in sound. A council decree proves that written records were prioritized for official matters, but oral transmission remained important for everyday communication, especially in informal or communal settings. The speaker continues, their hands occasionally moving to emphasize a point. The gestures are not rigid, but natural, shaped by rhythm rather than instruction. The listeners respond in subtle ways, small shifts of posture, brief nods, quiet reactions. Oddly enough, ancient sources suggest that storytelling often blended historical events with symbolic elements, creating narratives that were both informative and interpretive at once. The boundary between fact and meaning is not always clearly drawn. You step slightly closer, careful not to interrupt. The speaker pauses briefly, then continues, voice lowering slightly as the story shifts tone. The group leans in almost imperceptibly, attention tightening. A curious footnote mentions that stories in ancient Mesopotamian cultures often carried layered meanings, where the same narrative could be understood differently depending on context or audience. You notice how the space itself supports the act of listening. The shade softens the light. The walls contain the sound. The arrangement of people naturally forms a circle of attention without formal instruction. Scholars bicker over how widespread public storytelling was in Assyrian cities compared to private or household contexts. Some argue it was a common form of entertainment and education. Others suggest it was more limited, shaped by social setting and occasion. As you listen, you catch fragments of themes within the speaker's words, journeys, decisions, consequences, not always tied to specific names or places, but structured in ways that feel familiar even without full detail. One scandalous aside from historical interpretation suggests that storytelling may have also served subtle social functions, allowing commentary or reflection on authority and behavior without direct confrontation. Meaning layered beneath narrative. You shift your weight slightly, noticing how still the group has become. Even the smallest movements feel intentional now, as if everyone has entered a shared mental space. No agreement has been reached on how closely these oral traditions align with written records. Some scholars emphasize continuity between spoken and written culture. Others highlight differences in flexibility and interpretation. The speaker reaches a pause, then briefly adjusts their posture before continuing. The rhythm resumes, steady but not identical to before, as if responding to the group's attention. You find yourself listening more closely than expected, not just to content, but to cadence, to timing, to silence between phrases. Records confirm that oral narratives often played a role in shaping cultural understanding, reinforcing shared values and collective memory, even when not formally recorded. A faint breeze passes through the shaded area, shifting the edges of fabric and dust in subtle motion. The sound of the city outside continues, but it feels distant here, filtered through attention. For a moment, it feels as though the story is creating its own small world. You notice a child seated near the edge of the group, eyes fixed on the speaker. Their expression is open, unguarded, absorbing without question. Nearby, an older listener occasionally reacts with slight changes in posture as if recognizing familiar patterns within the narrative. The speaker slows slightly, then emphasizes a final phrase before pausing again. Silence follows, not empty, but held. One scandalous aside from interpretive readings of ancient traditions suggests that such moments of storytelling may have been used to reinforce shared identity, especially in societies where written literacy was limited to certain groups. The pause continues just long enough for meaning to settle. Then the speaker resumes, but in a gentler tone. You realize that nothing here is rushed. Even attention has its rhythm. As you begin to step back from the gathering, you feel the sound of the voice remain briefly behind you, continuing without interruption. It does not follow you, but it does not end either. It simply carries on within its own space. And as you return to the street, you carry with you the awareness that in this empire stories are not just entertainment. They are memory shaped in real time, passed forward, held briefly, then released again into the flow of people and place. The voice of the storyteller fades behind you, but not in a clean break. It lingers in fragments, like echoes caught between walls, drifting through your thoughts as you step back into the brighter street. The city feels slightly different again now, as if your awareness has become more sensitive to what normally passes unnoticed. For a moment it feels as though even silence has texture here. You follow a gradual incline toward a quieter section of the city where the air shifts once more. There is less movement, fewer overlapping voices. Instead you hear intermittent sounds, a distant grind of stone, a soft clink of metal tools, the occasional murmur between figures working in close proximity. A faint medicinal scent reaches you, herbs, dry leaves, something bitter beneath it. You turn toward it. The building is modest compared to temples or administrative halls, but it carries a sense of careful order. Inside shelves line the walls holding small containers, bundles of dried plants, and clay vessels sealed with care. Light filters in softly through narrow openings, illuminating dust suspended in the air. For a moment, it feels as though the space itself is measuring time differently. Records confirm that Assyrian healing practices combined practical treatments with ritual elements, blending observation of symptoms with spiritual interpretations of illness and imbalance. Medicine here is not separated from belief. It exists within it. You step carefully inside. A figure stands near a low table, examining a small bowl of crushed herbs. Their movements are slow, deliberate, as they lift a portion and let it fall back into the container, watching texture and consistency. Your mind drifts to the idea of care, not as abstraction, but as action repeated with attention. A council decree proves that certain practitioners, often referred to as healers or physicians in later interpretations, were recognized within administrative systems, though their roles varied depending on region and tradition. The figure glances briefly toward you, but does not speak. Instead, they return their focus to the preparation, adjusting proportions with precise practiced motions. Oddly enough, ancient texts suggest that symptoms were sometimes recorded and compared, creating early forms of diagnostic observation, even if explained through spiritual frameworks rather than modern scientific ones. A curious footnote mentions that some treatments involved poultices, herbal infusions, and ointments, applied with careful timing and repeated observation of effect. It is a system shaped by experience as much as belief. You notice a second person seated nearby, quietly observing while grinding something in a stone bowl. The repetitive motion is steady, almost meditative. Each rotation produces a faint, consistent sound that fills the room without dominating it. Scholars bicker over how much of Assyrian medicine was empirical versus ritualistic. Some argue that practical knowledge of herbs and treatments was significant and effective. Others emphasize the symbolic and spiritual framing that guided interpretation of illness. As you watch, the boundary between the two feels less clear. A small jar is opened, releasing a sharper scent that briefly cuts through the softer herbal tones. The healer leans in slightly, adjusting the mixture again before sealing it carefully. One scandalous, aside from historical interpretations, hints that knowledge of remedies may have been closely guarded in certain circles, passed through apprenticeship or familial lines rather than widely shared. You shift your stance slightly, careful not to disturb the rhythm of work around you. The room feels contained but not closed. There is flow here, just slower, more deliberate. No agreement has been reached on how standardized medical practice was across the Assyrian Empire. Some scholars suggest localized traditions played a major role. Others point to recurring patterns that imply shared knowledge systems. The healer finally steps back, examining the prepared mixture for a moment before setting it aside. The action feels like completion, though nothing dramatic marks it. Just readiness. You notice how even here within a space dedicated to care, structure is present. Organization of tools, sequence of actions, repetition refined over time. Records confirm that health and illness were deeply integrated into broader social and religious life, with treatments often accompanied by prayers or invocations alongside physical remedies. A faint breeze passes through the room, stirring the edges of dried herbs hanging near the ceiling. Their scent shifts slightly, momentarily stronger, then softens again. For a moment, it feels as though the space is breathing gently with its contents. You take a slow breath, noticing how calm the environment is despite its purpose. There is no urgency in the movements, only attention, adjustment, response. The second figure continues grinding in steady rhythm, unbroken, as if the motion itself is part of understanding. As you step toward the exit, the healer briefly turns, placing the finished preparation carefully into storage. The motion is precise, final, but unhurried. But Outside, the light feels brighter again after the dim interior. The sounds of the city return gradually layered but familiar. Yet something remains with you, the awareness that care in this world is not separate from structure or belief. It is woven into both, practiced, refined, repeated until it becomes part of how life is maintained. As you walk on, the scent of herbs fades slowly behind you, replaced once again by dust, stone, and movement. But the sense of quiet attention stays with you, like something carefully held and not yet released. The scent of herbs fades gradually as you step back into the brighter artery of the city, replaced once again by dust, sun, and the layered movement of daily life. Yet something about your awareness has shifted. You notice things differently now, not just what people are doing, but who passes through this place and from where they might have come. For a moment, it feels as though the city is no longer just Assyrian. It is something larger. You follow the street as it opens into a broader commercial zone where movement increases again. But this is not the same rhythm you felt in the earlier market. There is a different texture here, more variety in dress, more unfamiliar faces, more accents in the way voices rise, fall. You realize you are watching a rival. Records confirm that the Assyrian Empire at its height incorporated a vast array of peoples from conquered regions, integrating them into its cities as traders, laborers, artisans, and officials. The empire does not only move outward, it pulls inward. You notice a group of travelers near a stall, their clothing distinct in cut and material. They speak among themselves before turning to exchange goods with a local merchant. The interaction is cautious, at first, then gradually more fluid. Your mind drifts to the idea of contact, not conquest, but coexistence under structure. A council decree proves that foreign merchants were permitted to operate within Assyrian cities under regulated conditions, contributing to trade networks that extended far beyond imperial borders. This is not isolation. It is controlled permeability. You step closer to a stall displaying unfamiliar items, objects that do not match the local materials you've seen so far. A different style of pottery, a small carved figurine with features that feel unfamiliar in proportion, textiles with patterns that do not repeat the local motifs. Oddly enough, archaeological evidence suggests that Assyria was deeply embedded in wider Near Eastern trade systems, exchanging goods with regions far beyond its borders, including Anatolia, the Levant, and parts of Iran. The empire is not sealed. It is connected. A curious footnote mentions that certain luxury items were highly mobile across regions, often passing through multiple hands before reaching their final destination, accumulating layers of meaning and value along the way. You watch as a transaction takes place nearby. The exchange is brief but careful. Items are examined. Gestures are made. A nod confirms agreement. No long negotiation, just recognition of terms understood. Scholars bicker over whether Assyrian control of trade was primarily restrictive or facilitative. Some argue that strict regulation ensured imperial benefit and stability. Others suggest that the system also enabled extensive exchange, making Assyria a central hub rather than a closed system. As you move through the space, you begin to notice how diversity manifests here, not in disorder, but in adaptation. Different styles of speech blending into shared patterns of exchange. Different goods arranged within a common structure of trade. A system that allows variation while maintaining framework. One scandalous aside from historical interpretations hints that foreign populations within Assyrian cities sometimes retained elements of their own customs, blending them subtly into daily life despite official structures. Culture here is not erased. It is layered. You pause near a group inspecting goods laid out on woven mats. A man points to an item, while another responds with a brief explanation, their interaction marked by gestures more than words. The exchange feels efficient, even when language differs. You notice a small child watching from behind one of the stalls, observing the interactions with quiet focus. Their gaze moves between unfamiliar objects and familiar behaviors, absorbing without comment. No agreement has been reached on how deeply cultural exchange influenced Assyrian urban life. Some scholars emphasize assimilation into dominant systems. Others highlight the persistence of regional identities within imperial spaces. A faint sound of multiple languages overlaps briefly in the air, then disperses again as conversations shift. Records confirm that Assyria's strength was partly derived from its ability to integrate diverse populations into its economic and administrative structures while maintaining overarching control. Integration and hierarchy existing at the same time. You step slightly to the side as a small group passes, carrying goods that appear to originate from a distant region. The packaging is different, the binding unfamiliar, yet the movement is seamless within the flow of the street. For a moment it feels as though the empire is not a single place, but a convergence of many. You observe how easily the system absorbs difference without collapsing into fragmentation. There is structure here that accommodates variation rather than erasing it entirely. A merchant calls out briefly, not in urgency but in invitation, drawing attention to a set of goods that clearly originate from outside the immediate region. The response is measured, curious. As you continue walking, the sounds of exchange fade slightly behind you, blending back into the broader rhythm of the city. Yet the impression remains that this empire is not only defined by its own identity, but by what it gathers, moves, and holds together within its structure. As you step forward, the city feels larger than before, not just in size, but in reach. The marketplace of foreign goods gradually dissolves behind you, but the feeling it leaves behind does not fade so easily. It lingers in your awareness, like a map you have not fully learned to read, yet one that suggests movement beyond what you can currently see. For a moment, it feels as though the city is no longer only receiving the world, but also resisting parts of it. You continue along a street that subtly tightens again, the noise thinning as you move away from the commercial convergence. The buildings here appear more uniform, their surfaces less varied, as if the city is gradually returning to its own internal rhythm. But something about the air has changed. There is tension in it now. Not loud, not visible, just present beneath the surface of movement. You notice fewer open exchanges, fewer casual stops. People pass more quickly, their attention more forward-focused. Even conversations seem shortened, as though time itself has become more constrained. Records confirm that while the Assyrian Empire expanded through conquest and incorporation, not all regions accepted its rule without resistance, leading to periodic unrest in different parts of the empire. That idea settles quietly into the background of what you are seeing. A group of officials passes you, their posture formal, their pace coordinated. They do not engage with the surrounding movement. Instead, they move through it as if following a fixed path invisible to others. Your mind drifts to the idea of pressure, not sudden, but sustained. A council decree proves that provincial governance required constant attention to ensure compliance with local administrators, reporting regularly to central authorities to maintain stability across distant territories. Control is not only established, it is maintained. You slow slightly as the street opens into a wider intersection. Here, movement becomes less linear. Paths cross, diverge, and reconnect. Yet even in this complexity, there is a sense of directionality, as if certain flows are more encouraged than others. Oddly enough, ancient records suggest that resistance to imperial authority could take many forms, from open rebellion to quieter acts of non-compliance that disrupted administrative expectations without immediate confrontation. It is not always visible in the moment. A curious footnote mentions that some regions required repeated military campaigns to reassert control, suggesting that stability was not a static condition but something continually negotiated. You notice a brief gathering ahead where a small group stands in a loose formation. The atmosphere is subdued, not chaotic but restrained. A figure at the center speaks in a measured tone, while others listen without interruption. Scholars bicker over how often such moments reflected genuine unrest versus routine administrative enforcement. Some argue that Assyrian rule was consistently challenged in outlying regions. Others suggest that much of the empire functioned smoothly most of the time, with disruptions being episodic rather than constant. As you draw closer, the group disperses without visible escalation. The exchange ends quickly, and movement resumes. One scandalous aside from historical interpretation hints that imperial authority often relied as much on perception as on force, with displays of power designed to reinforce expectations of compliance, even in the absence of direct action. You continue walking, noticing how the rhythm of the street subtly shifts again, not broken, but adjusted. The sense of stability remains, but it feels more actively maintained here. No agreement has been reached on how pervasive resistance was across the Assyrian Empire at any given time. Some scholars emphasize the scale of control and administrative efficiency. Others highlight the recurring need for reassertion of authority in certain regions. A faint sound of distant movement reaches you perhaps from another administrative exchange further along the network of streets. It is brief, then gone. For a moment, you consider how control is experienced differently depending on where you stand within it. To some it may feel like order, to others pressure. You pass a wall where markings indicate official designation or instruction, though the details are not immediately clear. The presence alone suggests direction, even if the content remains unreadable to you. Records confirm that imperial systems often relied on visible markers of authority within urban spaces to reinforce structure and ensure recognition of administrative zones and responsibilities. As you move past, the markings fade behind you, absorbed again into the architecture of the street. The tension you sensed earlier does not disappear, but it becomes less distinct, blending into the broader environment. You begin to understand that this empire does not shift between stability and instability in simple terms. Instead, it holds both, constantly adjusting, constantly responding. As you continue forward, the city resumes its familiar rhythm, but you are now more aware of the effort behind its continuity. The subtle tension of the previous streets begins to dissolve as you continue forward, but it does not fully disappear. Instead, it changes shape again, becoming something broader, more distant, like a pressure that exists at the edge of awareness rather than directly in front of you. For a moment, it feels as though the city is stretching outward beyond itself. You find yourself on a road that gradually widens and then narrows again, as if shaped by repeated passage rather than deliberate design. The movement here is steady but purposeful, not the local rhythm of markets or households, but something with direction behind it. You notice more travelers carrying supplies, more organized groups moving with clear intent. Soldiers, but not the ones you saw earlier in training or courtyard gatherings. These figures are different, more equipped, more focused. Their presence is less about preparation and more about departure. Records confirm that the Assyrian Empire maintained continuous military campaigns throughout much of its history, expanding its borders through repeated expeditions into surrounding regions. Standing here, you can almost feel that outward motion in the air itself. Your mind drifts to the idea of constant movement, not arrival, but extension. A council decree proves that military campaigns were often structured in cycles with seasonal timing and logistical planning designed to sustain long-distance operations across difficult terrain. War here is not an event. It is a pattern. You step aside as a group passes their equipment, carefully arrange their formation, loose but coordinated. They do not speak much as they move. Their attention is forward-oriented towards something beyond your view. Oddly enough, ancient records describe Assyrian campaigns as highly organized, relying on supply lines, local resources, and administrative planning to sustain extended operations far from the core cities. It is not only strength that drives expansion, it is structure. A curious footnote mentions that royal inscriptions often emphasized victories in great detail, highlighting not just conquest, but the scale and reach of campaigns, reinforcing the perception of an expanding and dominant power. You watch as a cart follows behind the group loaded with provisions. Its wheels creak slightly under weight, but its movement remains steady. It is part of the same rhythm, just less visible. Scholars bicker over whether Assyrian expansion was driven primarily by economic necessity, political ambition, or ideological framing of kingship. Some argue that all three played roles simultaneously, shaping a cycle of continuous outward movement. As you continue along the road, you begin to notice markers along the edges, subtle indications of distance or direction, worn but still visible. They suggest that this path is not isolated but part of a larger network extending far beyond what you can currently see. One scandalous, aside from historical interpretations, hints that some campaigns may have been more about maintaining authority over existing territories than simply acquiring new ones, blurring the line between expansion and consolidation. You pause briefly as another group passes this one, carrying fewer visible supplies but maintaining the same disciplined pace. Their presence reinforces the sense that movement outward is not occasional but ongoing. No agreement has been reached on how sustainable this constant military activity was over long periods. Some scholars emphasize the efficiency and organization that made it possible. Others point to the strain it likely placed on resources and populations. A faint sound of coordinated movement echoes from further down the road, then fades, replaced by the ambient noise of the city behind you. You begin to sense a dual rhythm, the city behind you and the empire extending beyond you. One contained, one expanding. As you walk, the direction of movement becomes more pronounced. Even when the street itself bends or shifts, the flow of traffic maintains a consistent outward orientation. Records confirm that imperial expansion was closely tied to administrative control, with newly incorporated regions integrated into existing systems of governance and resource extraction, ensuring continuity across distance. You notice how the soldier's presence subtly alters the movement of others. People adjust their paths, step aside, allow passage without hesitation. Not fear exactly, but recognition of structure in motion. As the group gradually disappears ahead, the road feels briefly emptier, though the impression of movement remains. You take a slow breath, aware now of how deeply direction shapes everything here. Not just where people are, but where they are going, and what carries them forward. As you continue, the sense of outward motion does not fade. It simply stretches further than your sight. The road continues its gradual pull outward, but the sense of movement begins to feel heavier, now less like simple travel and more like something sustained over long periods. The dust beneath your feet is finer here, disturbed constantly by passing groups that never fully settle before moving on again. For a moment, it feels as though the city is no longer the center of anything, but a point within a much larger system of motion. You notice the rhythm changing again? Fewer civilians now, more organized formations, supply wagons, messengers, soldiers, each group distinct, yet all moving in the same general direction, as though guided by an invisible structure extending beyond the visible road. Records confirm that Assyrian imperial power depended on continuous military and administrative activity, requiring repeated campaigns, tribute collection, and governance to maintain control over distant regions. Standing here, that continuity becomes almost tangible. You step slightly to the side as another group passes, their equipment worn but carefully maintained. Their pace is steady, but there is a fatigue in their posture that does not interrupt their movement. It is carried rather than expressed. Your mind drifts to the idea of endurance. Not sudden force, but repetition stretched across time. A council decree proves that imperial campaigns were often part of long-term strategic cycles, requiring coordination between military, administrative, and logistical systems that operated far beyond a single city or season. It is not a single push outward. It is ongoing pressure. Oddly enough, historical records suggest that even when territories were formally incorporated into the empire, they often required continued oversight, tribute enforcement, and occasional military presence to ensure stability. Control does not end at conquest. You watch as a supply line passes slower than the soldiers, but just as structured. Animals laden with goods move in sequence, guided by handlers who rarely speak unless necessary. A curious footnote mentions that Assyrian kings often recorded campaigns in great detail, emphasizing both the scale of movement and the reach of their authority, reinforcing the idea of an empire defined by expansion and maintenance simultaneously. Scholars bicker over whether this constant cycle of expansion was sustainable in the long term, or whether it gradually strained the very systems that enabled it. Some argue for resilience built into administrative design. Others point to signs of overextension in later periods. As you continue walking, the road subtly rises, offering a wider view ahead. From here, you can see multiple streams of movement branching off in different directions, all part of a larger network that disappears into the horizon. One scandalous, aside from historical interpretations, hints that not all regions incorporated into the empire remained stable, requiring repeated intervention and adjustment. though the details vary across sources and remain debated. You notice how the flow of movement is not uniform. Some groups move quickly, almost urgently. Others proceed at a slower, more deliberate pace, yet all are part of the same outward structure. No agreement has been reached on how much resistance or compliance define these extended networks of control. Some scholars emphasize the effectiveness of Assyrian administration in maintaining cohesion across vast distances. Others highlight the challenges inherent in governing such a wide and diverse domain. A faint breeze moves across the road, lifting dust briefly before it settles again. In that moment of movement, the entire scene feels suspended between stillness and continuation. You pause for a moment, watching as another group passes. Their presence reinforces the sense that the empire is not confined to a single place. It is distributed, extended, maintained through constant motion. Records confirm that communication, military presence, and resource movement were essential in sustaining imperial reach, ensuring that distant regions remained connected to the center of authority even across long spans of geography. As you begin walking again, the direction of travel feels more pronounced than before. Not just forward, but outward in principle, as if the road itself participates in the logic of expansion. The city behind you is no longer fully visible, but its influence remains present in every group you pass, every organized movement, every coordinated step. You begin to understand that in this system, power is not static. It is carried, extended, repeated. And as the road continues ahead, disappearing into distance, so too does the sense that this movement will ever fully conclude. It only changes form. The road begins to lose its density of traffic, though it does not fall silent. Instead, the movement becomes more selective, as if only certain flows are allowed to continue this far. The dust here is finer, more settled between disturbances, and each passing group seems to carry greater purpose. For a moment, it feels as though you are approaching the edge of something vast without ever reaching a true boundary. You notice the landscape shifting subtly. Structures become fewer, but more spaced out, often serving clear, singular functions. Small fortified posts, supply depots, simple watchpoints overlooking stretches of road that extend far into the distance. The empire does not end here. It is simply maintained differently. Records confirm that Assyrian administrative and military systems extended well beyond major urban centers, relying on outposts, garrisons, and communication stations to support long-distance governance and control. Standing here, you can sense those systems not as isolated points, but as a connected framework. You slow your pace slightly as a small group passes, their movements less hurried than earlier travelers, but still structured. There is no hesitation in their direction, only continuity. Your mind drifts to the idea of strain, not collapse, but tension held over time. A council decree proves that maintaining control over distant regions required continuous logistical support, including supplies, personnel, rotation, and communication relays, to ensure that authority remained functional far from the core cities. Oddly enough, archaeological findings suggest that some frontier regions experienced cycles of stronger and weaker central presence depending on political and military conditions within the empire itself. Control here is not uniform. It fluctuates. You notice a structure ahead, partially elevated, overlooking the road. A small group of officials stands there, observing movement without directly engaging. Their stillness contrasts with the motion below. A curious footnote mentions that such positions may have served both practical and symbolic functions, allowing authorities to monitor travel while reinforcing the visible presence of oversight in key areas. Scholars bicker over whether the effectiveness of Assyrian control depended more on constant physical presence or on the expectation of response. Some argue that the perception of reach was as important as its actual execution. As you continue forward, the road appears to split more frequently, branching into routes that lead toward different distant regions. Each branch carries its own stream of movement, yet all remain part of a shared structure. One scandalous aside from historical interpretations hints that the farther regions of the empire may have required more negotiation and adaptation than the core territories, suggesting that governance was not identical across all zones. You pause briefly near a marker post, its surface worn, but still bearing faint indications of direction or designation. It stands as a quiet reminder that distance here is organized, not random. No agreement has been reached on how uniformly Assyrian authority was experienced across its full extent. Some scholars emphasize strong central cohesion. Others highlight variation and local autonomy shaped by necessity. A faint sound of coordinated movement passes in the distance, then fades again, absorbed into the vastness ahead. You begin to feel the scale of what you have been following. Not a single city, not even a chain of cities, but a system extended across land maintained through repetition, movement, and adjustment. Records confirm that imperial endurance depended on maintaining these extended networks, ensuring that resources, information, and authority could circulate continuously between center and periphery. As you walk, the presence of structured movement continues even as visible density decreases. It is no longer crowded, but it is still connected. Each passing group reinforces the sense that nothing here exists in isolation. Everything is part of a broader flow, a larger pattern of continuity stretching beyond immediate sight. You take a slow breath, noticing how the horizon seems more open now, the sky broader without the dense framing of city walls. And yet the structure has not disappeared. It has simply expanded. As you continue along the road, the sense of outward reach remains present, steady and unbroken. Not ending, only extending. The road ahead no longer feels like a path leaving a city behind. Instead, it feels like something still inside the empire, even here, where buildings are sparse and movement is stretched thin. The sense of distance has changed. It is no longer separation. It is continuation. For a moment, it feels as though everything you have seen is still unfolding at once, just at different depths of the same structure. You slow your pace. The soundscape is different here, less layered, more open. Wind becomes more noticeable, carrying dust across the road in thin, shifting lines. The occasional traveler passes, but there is no crowd now, only intervals of movement, spaced across time. Records confirm that Assyrian imperial reach was maintained not only through cities and armies, but through continuous systems of connection, ensuring that even remote regions remain tied into administrative, military, and economic networks. Standing here, that connection feels less like geography and more like presence. You glance back once. The direction you came from is no longer defined clearly. It blends into distance, into roads that no longer feel distinct from one another. Your mind drifts to the idea of continuity, not expansion, not control, but persistence. A council decree proves that imperial systems were designed to function across distance and time, relying on repetition of movement, communication, and enforcement to sustain coherence, even when physical oversight was limited. Oddly enough, some archaeological evidence suggests that frontier zones experienced gradual blending of local and imperial practices, creating spaces where identity and governance were not strictly separated but interwoven. You notice a faint structure ahead, partially worn, perhaps once a checkpoint or station. It stands quietly now, its purpose softened by time or reduced activity. Yet its presence still suggests former coordination. A curious footnote mentions that even when active control diminished in certain areas, the memory of imperial structure often remained embedded in roads, boundaries, and local practices. Scholars bicker over whether empires like Assyria should be understood primarily through moments of strength, or through the systems that outlast immediate political action. Some argue that the true power lies in infrastructure rather than events. As you stand in the open stretch of road, you begin to feel that distinction more clearly. Not everything here is visible authority. Some of it is residual, embedded. Continued. One scandalous, aside from historical interpretations, hints that the perception of imperial permanence may have been as influential as its actual administrative reach, shaping how distant regions understood their place within the system. The wind moves again, softer now, lifting and settling dust in slow patterns across the ground. The road stretches in both directions without clear emphasis on beginning or end. No agreement has been reached on how far Assyrian control remained active versus symbolic in its outermost regions. Some scholars emphasize decline at the edges. Others emphasize continuity through adaptation. You take a slow breath, noticing how the silence here is not empty, but expanded. It contains distance, movement, memory of movement. Records confirm that even after direct control weakened in certain areas, cultural, economic, and administrative traces of the empire could persist, influencing later systems long after political structures shifted. As you look forward again, the road continues without interruption. It does not demand attention. It does not assert direction. It simply extends. You begin to understand that what you have been walking through is not only a place, it is a system of continuation, where cities, fields, courts, temples, and roads are not separate worlds, but connected expressions of one structure that holds itself together through repetition and flow. And as you stand there with wind moving quietly across the empty stretch of road, the empire no longer feels distant behind you. It feels ongoing, not finished, not paused, but still in some form continuing, and you are simply within it. Sweet dreams.